Chapter 363. The people who presided over the meeting were the undying bird as the representative of the explorers and the fox as the representative of the scholars. The people who participated in the meeting all squatted in front of Huaisher, and a few couldn't sit still and ran to Huaisher's nose and horns. Due to the urgency of the situation, there was no time for fancy things like a meeting room or a Doomsday countermeasure headquarters. Everyone just needed to find a place to sit down. There wasn't even a cup of tea. The monster meeting was that simple and direct. I think everyone already understands the specific situation, so I won't say more. The six-winged, undying bird said straightforwardly, "Everyone work together and try to survive the Doomsday. This is no longer a problem that can be solved by one person. If anyone wants to fly alone, say it, and I will send him out." Once the words were spoken, everyone had no objections. At this time, those who wanted to leave the group and act on their own were definitely brainless examples. Leaving this kind of idiot was also a scourge, so it was better to simply send him away. The world was about to be destroyed, and they still had their own little plans. It was completely reckless. What's more, 80% of the people who entered here were members of the Astronomical Association and naturally belonged to the same system. At this moment, no one objected to the undying bird and the fox taking over the management rights. In addition to relying on force to survive the Doomsday, wasn't it also relying on brains? There was no way out if one went alone. They would starve to death. Well, except for Huaisher. The reason he stayed was very simple. He just wanted to find someone to talk to. These days, he always felt lost in his heart, as if he had forgotten something, but when he thought about it carefully, he couldn't remember it. This made him feel particularly lonely. He always felt that he shouldn't be like this, but he couldn't tell what it should be. He thought he just lost something, but no matter what, he couldn't say what he lost. It could only be attributed to excessive mental pressure. It was a pity that no doctor could prescribe him any medicine, and there was no medicine large enough to be thrown into his mouth and have enough medicinal effect. 2 puffs of air came out of his nostrils gloomily, raising a cloud of dust. Then he was glared at by several approaching behemoths. He smiled awkwardly and stopped talking. His mind was wandering. For some reason, he was in a bad mood. He wasn't even interested in exploring the witch's night anymore. Just let it be. Anyway, it was fun to slack off. The phoenix and the fox had obviously made arrangements long ago. After everyone expressed their opinions, they quickly divided the responsibilities and personnel. All of the behemoths obviously had their own work to do. For example, Hydra, as one of the few alchemists here, had to maintain a deep balance in the city. He had to smoothly discharge all the abyssal sediment from the preset flood diversion channel to avoid any hidden dangers that would accumulate over a long period of time and suddenly erupt, turning all the races into erosion species. The huge, flying jellyfish in the sky, Huang Yuqian, was responsible for the water supply. Except for her talent, it was difficult for the people here to produce a large amount of pure water for the city's drinking and industrial use in a short period of time. It was worth mentioning that the Taurus constellation was not present. As the creation of Gear Air Tai, the Taurus constellation turned itself into an energy creature, looking like a floating thundercloud. But now, as the world gradually became desolate, it was difficult for the Taurus constellation to maintain its shape. Like a candle in the wind, it could only live in the central reactor of the Titan Empire. As the energy director, he was responsible for managing the central reactor. With him around, at least the energy problem would not be too much to worry about in the short term. Anyway, it was not afraid of radiation. In the past 2 days, it had begun to conduct fission experiments. Presumably, it would soon be able to enter the nuclear power generation. This group of cheating scholars had already built airplanes and launched satellites in the steam age. When the time came, who knew what they would come up with? The scholars would stabilize the law in the abyss and try to maintain the depth of an area so that it would not be too exaggerated. With the help of alchemists, they would avoid distortions and strange phenomena in the gathering area. And now, the tens of millions of various evolved races in the city were their hands and feet and eyes. These species created by the explorers of the race route did not have too many distracting thoughts and desires except for their own nature. And they were 100% obedient to the orders of the patriarch, which was the best way to maintain them. Then, as the water source and energy were settled, the food was also handed over to another tree person who had completed the transformation of deification. Other crops, such as wheat, were a little troublesome, but mushrooms were enough. It was foreseeable that for a long time to come, the eternal Titan Empire would be shrouded in the shadow of mushrooms. There would be endless stir-fried mushrooms, steamed mushrooms, mushroom stew, abyssal mushroom soup. Huaishur was in the mood to talk to the tree person about cooking in a low voice. In the end, when the conversation was about to end, the tree person had already patted its chest and said, "It's a piece of cake. I'll go back and make some glowing mushrooms, the kind that will release colorful golden light when cooked. It's high-end." Presumably, the group of goblins, kobolds, and even gnomes would smile happily if they knew that they would have glowing dishes to eat every day in the future. Then he found that most of the participants had left. That's it. Huaishur stared at the undying bird in disbelief. The undying bird nodded. "Yes, but it's not my turn yet." Huaishur moved closer to the dog's head and opened his eyes wide. "What about mine? What about mine?" The undying bird was stunned for a moment and looked at him strangely. "You can continue to be in charge of the smelting center. Aren't you doing a good job?" Anyway, Huaishur was responsible for dozing off, drooling, and occasionally sneezing to light the fire for the largest steelmaking furnace. He himself was equivalent to a complete giant steel assembly line. Now that so many scholars had come to assist him, the efficiency was naturally even more amazing. But the problem was that it was too boring. Every day, he squatted in one place and dozed off. He could no longer suppress the primitive restlessness in the depths of his blood in his chest. He wanted to dismantle something. For the past 2 days, when he looked up at the city not far away, he could not help but feel a little eager to try. "I think you're doing a good job." "Very good." The undying bird frantically tried to dissuade him. "It's enough. Many big bosses are not as good as you. You don't have to do it anymore. Besides, you're so big. There aren't so many tasks for you. If there was something for Huaishur, Huaishur would get up and stomp his foot, and the thing would be gone." The team of kobolds that accidentally fell into his mouth when they brushed his teeth last time had not crawled out of his stomach yet. Usually, when he sneezed, the whole city would shake. Every few days, when he held a mountain edge and ground his teeth, the people in the geological observatory wanted to collectively hang themselves. And when he was sleeping and snoring, the ones who wanted to hang themselves would be everyone. Too annoying. Too annoying. Wait a minute. Huaishur's mind flashed. "I can also provide a 24-hour disco service." Afraid that his words were not convincing enough, he turned his head and turned on the colorful aperture behind him. Then, under the colorful changing lights, jubilant disco hymns sounded. "You see, you can't ignore the construction of spiritual civilization in the apocalypse." Huaishur proudly raised the corner of his eyes. "I'm not bragging. When I opened the evil spirit ancient, when I opened the bar, none of the customers who came to play gave me a bad review." The undying bird's expression twitched. "Sorry, this kind of help is really not needed." But looking at Huaishur's enthusiastic eyes, he could not say anything to refuse. Thinking that Huaishur was only 17 years old, he could not help but sigh. This child was really not easy. I just feel a little surprised that I can play the role of the gods one day. He paused for a moment and revealed a strange smile. Say, in the era before the ancient times, would a creature like me be called the Grim Reaper? Huaishur was stunned for a moment. In order to complete his work, Hydra basically lived underground in the city, the place where the abyssal sediment was the thickest in the entire city. All the dead consciousness would sink there along with the dissipated source substance, and then be burned in the converter. The remaining abyssal sediment would be separated out along with the matrix. It was through this method that the depth and stability of the city could be guaranteed, and it would not turn into a strange hell overnight. In terms of duties and appearance, Hydra could indeed call himself the Grim Reaper in this short dream. If I'm the Grim Reaper, then the Phoenix is the sun god, Desolation is the water god, and the Taurus is the thunder god. Other than that, there are also the satellites of the god of light. The scholars gathered together can be called the god of wisdom. Those sentries flying in the sky all day long will be called the god of messengers and travel. Don't you think it's reasonable? What about me? Huaishur blinked curiously. What kind of god am I? What do you think? Look at you lying in the smelting center every day. Of course you are the god of forging and craftsmanship. Do you still need to think about it? Hydra looked at Huaishur's current body shape and nodded. According to the Pantheon period before the Holy Spirit genealogy in Rome, you might be the type with the blood of the Titans. Huaishur could not help but roll his eyes. You just want to say that I'm ugly, right? Ha ha, you're quite self-aware, aren't you? In the face of Hydra's teasing, Huaishur raised his claws indifferently and grabbed a handful of ores from the pile of ores beside him. He chewed on them like peanuts and spat out the ores all over the ground. Amidst the loud rumbling sounds, Hydra could not help but feel a headache. He glanced at Huaishur and said, "You rascal! Did you grow bigger recently?" "Did I? I don't think so." Huaishur was at a loss. He pinched the fat on his stomach. "But I'm definitely fat. I don't have enough exercise. Is there anything for me to take apart?" Hydra rolled his eyes. "Pretend I didn't say anything." Not long after the conversation came to an end, the high-pitched roar of steel rubbing against each other came from the direction of the laboratory behind the smelting center. Amidst the loud rumbling of the mountains, the huge ceiling of the workshop slowly opened. The deafening sound of a siren was heard. Accompanied by the steam that filled the sky, the weird metal giant got rid of the support frame. It slowly propped up its forelegs and climbed up amidst the grinding sounds that made one's teeth ache. It took 2 steps forward and another 2 steps forward. It actually did not fall apart. "Ahahaha, did you see that? You bunch of idiots. My ultimate weapon, number 0. Modified 2. I finally succeeded." A hysterical laugh came from the chest of the metal giant. It was so excited that it could not control itself. It pulled the joystick and drove the giant to walk on the ground. It looked in the direction of Huaishur and proudly placed its hands on its waist. It meant, "Look at my steam-powered metal giant. Isn't it awesome?" Huaishur lowered his head and looked at it for a while. He raised his hand silently and gave a thumbs up, giving it a compliment of the size of a giant. It meant that it was like. He was too lazy to complain about this guy. Regardless of how ridiculous the logic of this ultimate weapon was, how could there be an opponent for you to fight in the final battle? Moreover, there were so many big guys here. How could it be your turn to fight? Anyway, this guy who was poisoned by the steam did not care. After getting Huaishur's approval, he proudly drove the metal robot and ran wildly. He announced to the group of colleagues in the city who were looking over, "Did you see that? I'm the one who just..." Boom. Before he could finish his words, There was a loud bang, and the metal giant exploded into pieces. Countless fragments were burned into molten iron in the air and fell into the wreckage on the ground with a sizzling sound. That ultimate weapon, Zero or whatever it was, welcomed its own ending before it could even achieve victory. Ah, the reflection furnace exploded. Hydra laughed gloatingly. I have already reminded him that steam power has a limit after all. The method of flying bricks with great strength is not applicable here. He didn't listen. I don't know if he's still alive. Should be, probably, maybe. Weisher was also a little unsure. He opened his eyes wide and looked over. Soon, he saw a parachute slowly opening from the cockpit. Thick smoke rose from the cockpit. A burnt kobold crawled out in a sorry state and coughed violently. Still alive. Well, at least he was still breathing. Weisher rolled his eyes. He was not surprised. Anyway, this was not the first time this guy was looking for trouble after he was transferred here and started to let himself loose. Looks like you're going to be busy. I'll leave first. Hydra still had work to do. He was not in the mood to get involved with the ultimate weapon. He was ready to leave before that guy pounced on Waller A. Dream and asked for the new alloy. "All right, I have a question to ask." Before leaving, Hydra raised the tip of his tail and patted the back of his head. He curiously looked at Weisher's neck. Between the countless steel scales, there was a rusty iron ball. "What is that?" he asked. "A bell." Weisher looked down at his neck in confusion. "Haven't you seen it before?" "No. I mean, why are you wearing a bell?" "I forgot." Weisher thought seriously for a long time and nodded seriously. "I think it's quite cute wearing it like this. What do you think?" "As long as you're happy." Hydra's 9 faces twitched at the same time. He turned around and was ready to leave. But just as he turned around, he saw a red light suddenly rising into the sky from the city. There was also a sharp alarm that was so loud that it tore everyone's eardrums. War alarm! Weisher and Hydra looked at each other and were stunned. What the hell? Half an hour later, the usual meeting place of the monsters, which was Weisher's nest, was already crowded with giant monsters who had rushed over. With the arrival of a truck, the new projector was already in place. The undying bird that had rushed back from afar folded its wings and slowly landed. Without waiting for him to stand still, the giant monsters started to ask questions. "What's the situation?" "I'm so thirsty." "Give me some water first. See for yourself." The undying bird took off the camera on its neck and threw it over. Then it opened its mouth wide and motioned for the desolate emperor to pour some rain. After finally drinking enough, it took a breath, and on the huge projection screen, which was in front of Weisher's chest, the video taken by the undying bird finally played to the most important part. On the barren land, countless surging black tide. Chapter 365. Oh, my God, monsters are attacking the city? The moment they saw the grayish-black tide, the beasts gasped. Some people couldn't believe it. Where did this playful crimson moon come from? Young people nowadays are playing with yesterday's broken boats. You can't keep up with the times. Can you stop talking about old jokes? Let's surf the internet together another day. I just said it, okay? It's not my fault that I can't keep up with the times. So you admit that you're talking about old jokes, right? The bird and the leopard bickered, but it heated up the atmosphere. It dispelled the shock and uneasiness in everyone's hearts, and the atmosphere was slightly relaxed. The image on the screen was still moving forward. It was as if they had flown into a gray ocean, and they couldn't see the end. Even with the Phoenix's extreme speed, it couldn't go deeper into the endless gray. It was better to say that even if they couldn't see it in person, everyone could catch a glimpse of the momentum and madness from the mottled gray. It was a mixture of pale white and dark, a gray color made of blood, and flesh. Every ripple, every rise and fall, and even every pixel represented the existence of the enemy. If they looked down from a high altitude where they couldn't reach, it was just an insignificant gray. But now, this boundless gray was gradually covering them. It would only take an instant to swallow up all their hard work over the past few days. Even if each individual was insignificant, what was terrifying was the terrifying scale. It was as if the malice of the whole world was united and imposed on this lonely city. Dark clouds covered the sky. Do you have a more detailed image? The one who asked was the representative of the scholars, the fox. From the beginning to the end, it had its tail curled up, and there was an iron pipe in the corner of its mouth. It smoked leisurely, and then smoke mixed with water vapor rose from its fox head. It was shockingly hot. Behind it, illusionary bubbles kept rising and then quickly bursting. Those were countless possibilities and branches. In the madness that was close to exhaustion, countless solutions and answers kept appearing and being rejected. Smack! He spat out a mouthful of blood. It habitually raised its tail to wipe its mouth, picked up its special cup of water, and rinsed its mouth. It wanted to vomit, but when it remembered that it was in Huaisher's head, it suddenly felt embarrassed and swallowed it. It coughed twice and said, "The reference conditions are not enough. I need more details." No, the phoenix shook her head. I wanted to go deeper, but I sensed something that could threaten me. That feeling, how should I describe it? It paused for a moment and said, seriously, just like the divine, remains. In the silence, no one said anything. Then, let me give you a briefing. Fox's voice was still calm. He didn't want to plant any seeds of disharmony because of the appearance of various weapons. In order to maintain stability, he deliberately maintained restraint in this aspect. Between military force and survival, he naturally leaned towards the latter. In the end, it was hard to buy with money. When the whole world gradually died, all the beasts would be prepared to fight to the death. They didn't even need much rationality and thinking. As long as they could feel hunger, they would instinctively seek the existence of food. Some of the higher species could still maintain their thinking ability after being deformed. They were more difficult to deal with. They would even suppress internal friction and choose to join forces with their former strong enemies. It was just like a miracle. If such an incident happened to humans, there would be countless poets singing about the greatness of human nature, right? But now, the beast's nature had also become great. It caught Fox off guard. He suppressed the anger and frustration in his heart and forced himself to remain calm. According to the estimation of the control room, according to their current speed, they should appear within our sight in another 5 days. Well, basically, it would be no different from reaching our doorstep by then. This speed might not be their highest speed. The diamond leopard, who had just livened up the atmosphere, reminded, if they are hunting, then they must conserve their strength to the greatest extent. Then 3 days it is. Fox said, "We have to prepare for the worst." And then someone asked, "Then conserve your strength, listen to orders, and bravely kill the enemy. There's no need to say more, but now is not the time for you to fight." Fox sternly reminded, "I don't think I need to remind everyone of the meaning of this city. A stable base is the premise of all our plans. It is best not to have heroes who run out to die without saying a word. Even if you can kill 10,000, 100,000, or even 1,000,000 enemies before you die, it's not worth it, because your corpses can catalyze more corpses, and you might even become one of the enemies after you die. So, the purpose of this meeting is to tell everyone that we will have a plan, we will carry out a plan, and we will win through this plan. That way, no matter how tragic the victory, it will not hurt us. Remember, our goal is not to win, but to continue living in this dead world, and to continue living better. As he spoke in a low voice, the city behind him rumbled. As countless buildings moved, the entire steel city was instantly riddled with holes. After the camouflage was removed, countless complex and massive underground fortifications were revealed, as well as countless silos that were aimed straight at the sky. Then, countless blazing flames lit up in the metal silos, bursting out with a roar and stirring up layers of air. Then, the scorching heat swept along with the hurricane. It pushed the heavy metal tree slowly into the sky. It was as if thousands of stars had shot into the sky in an instant, illuminating the dark world in an instant, revealing a magnificent and desolate silhouette and dull gray hue. Then, the thousands of stars silently flew into the distance, just like the stars scattered in all directions. These messengers that symbolized peace did not have a single edge from top to bottom. Using a soft, streamlined design, they did not carry the slightest hint of hostility. The three-stage jet design ensured that the copy would be delivered to the recipient as quickly as possible. On their outer shells were sealed matrices meticulously created by alchemists to preserve the laws and rules of physics from the present world. And in the inner space, there was a gift from the host. Yes, a certain precious element that would release a green light that represented harmlessness and environmental protection. Even the corrosive species that did not know manners and civilization would be moved to tears after receiving this gift, right? Through such friendly greetings, everyone would establish friendship and bonds, then resolve misunderstandings, and live happily in this world together. It was as if they saw such a beautiful future waving at them. Everyone's lips couldn't help but curl into a smile. Wait a minute. Didn't you say that our war preparations are only at the standard level? This is the standard level, that's right. Fox replied calmly, wagging her tail. It's just that the standards of the Abyss Development Bureau are a little different from the standards of other departments. In the regulations of the Development Bureau, even if it was a standard-level war plan, it should be enough to fight a war of attrition with 3 times the number of abyssal civilizations with the same level of technology. If it was not for the fact that the laws of physics in the present world were gradually becoming difficult to apply as the depth decreased, and they had to rely on alchemy to maintain it, their reserves should be enough to send all of Australia to the sky. Chapter 366, filled with sincere prayers for peace. The metal tree pierced through the sky with flames. Thousands of miles away, the spreading gray tide suddenly stopped. A resounding and sharp voice came from the depths of the gray tide, instantly suppressing all other noises. Even around the huge figure, ripples were instantly set off. Wherever the ripples passed, all the tiny mutants were forcefully shaken to death amidst the angry cries and were immediately devoured by their frenzied companions. Hunger wrapped around the consciousness of every beast, causing the mutants to fall into an endless frenzy. If not for the pressure from the leaders of the large group, they would probably have devoured each other first. Sensing the danger from afar, the leaders of the large group fell into a quarrel. But soon, the stagnant gray tide suddenly shook and set off 2 completely different waves, colliding with each other. The gray tide closed in from all sides. Then the ground cracked and a thick tentacle stretched out, wrapping around the leader of the large group, who had advocated for retreat, and abruptly closing in. Slurry splattered everywhere. Soon after, the tentacle retracted, allowing the gray tide to completely devour the dissidents. Soon, the gray tide that had paused moved forward again without any hesitation. In all directions, there were constant cries and responses from the large group in the distance. One after another, the gray tide gradually dispersed, like a thin liquid, madly rushing forward amidst the incessant screams and cries of orders. Not long after, the metal tree fell from the sky. It was as if the stars were falling again. Amidst the rumbling, in the satellite observatory, Fox raised his binoculars and scrutinized the darkness in the distance. He only saw a sudden light in the endless darkness. The blazing heat quickly spread and rose, instantly tearing apart the seemingly eternal darkness, spewing out a vast amount of light and heat, as well as endless love and insignificant destruction. Destruction was planted into the soil like a seed, and soon the fruit of destruction grew. It was too far away to hear the mournful cries of death and the loud rumbling, but he could feel the deep tremors coming from the ground in the distance. The tremors spread like ripples. As the seeds of destruction fell from the sky one after another, lush and solemn trees of flame grew from the ground one after another. Extremely cold and fanatical light adorned the tree trunk, while the dazzling radiation and gray-black clouds turned into its flowers and tree trunk. It covered the earth. As the rays spread out, the gray tide paused for a moment. Countless tiny fragments that were hard to see with the naked eye were thrown into the air by the hurricane and instantly evaporated in the horrifying high temperature. One after another, the gigantic silhouettes were burned to ashes and fell to the ground. The sky was scorching red, like iron. The barren land glowed and sang aloud to the tune of extinction. How beautiful! The fox stared at the solemn scene through the telescope in a daze. His fur stood on end, and he was almost moved to tears. It was as if a distant dream had finally come true. On this day, the valley rose, the mountain fell, the bumpy road became a smooth road, and the holy light was revealed and illuminated the world. It was so immersed in this solemn scene that it did not notice the strange look on its companion's face and the distance between them. Damn, your fetish is too weird. We can't talk about it. No matter how beautiful the scene was, one would eventually get tired of it. After watching for a while, Fox instructed the members of the observation post to compile a detailed casualty report for him before leaving via the satellite. There was still too much work for it to do. How much damage could the power of fission inflict on the enemy? In front of such a huge number and scale, even the energy of atoms gradually paled in comparison. This was just an appetizer, a greeting. There were more things that needed to be prepared. Time waits for no man, so it had to speed up. After the first salvo cleared all the stocks, a total of more than 900 reserves, the assembly line of the military factory began to operate rapidly. From that moment on, the Eternal Titan Empire maintained a firing rate of 1 rocket every half an hour, and each rocket was a standard yield of 5 million tons. The frame of the central silo needed to be replaced every hour, or the molten metal liquid on it would hinder the next launch. The smelting center was also operating at full capacity. Weischer's doghead rotated between the 3 giant smelting furnaces that had just been built, working overtime around the clock. Accompanied by the howling hurricane, the atomic clock showed that in the evening of the second day, the destructive radiation cloud finally spread under the sweeping wind. Under the illumination of the searchlights, the black clouds were faintly tinged with dark green. A large amount of radioactive dust with high concentration of radiation was flying in the air, causing the Geiger counters around the city to start screaming crazily. If not for the increasingly thin air, they would have faced more than 100 times more pollution, right? But it didn't matter. The huge black stork rose from its peak and spread its wings. The thin air began to riot, and countless pale waves of air reverberated between heaven and earth. As it flew and circled, the thin air actually formed a calamity-grade storm. The violent wind violently pulled the radiation cloud, instantly pulling most of the dark green clouds into it and rapidly shrinking. Too slow, too slow. The giant stork cursed in dissatisfaction. Who asked him to be the one who was targeted the most by the environment? When he was deified, he chose the direction of controlling fluids, but now most of the fluids in the natural world had already disappeared. not to mention the water source. Even the air was almost gone. If not for the oxygen-producing equipment, perhaps the people in the Titan Empire would have suffocated to death. Without the air, its power lost its biggest application field, and it could only play a small role in some research and production. This was very annoying. But when it thought that there were people worse off than it, it began to gloat. "It's coming. Open your mouth." As the wings suddenly closed, the storm of radiation dust that filled the sky suddenly turned into a beam, whistling toward the distance behind the city. There, a massive wolf head slowly rose up, opening its eyes that were as bright as the sun and the moon. Countless sharp teeth slowly rose, revealing a bottomless throat. Facing the storm flying toward it, it took a deep breath, and a huge amount of radiation dust was swallowed into Huaishur's stomach. Burp! Huaishur's nostrils spurted out 2 silver and dazzling ion jets, and then it sneezed, shaking its head as if nothing had happened, and shouted at the top of its voice, "Is there more?" Then the air rioted, and only a low voice crazily echoed in the roar of thunder. More, 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 more. Countless dust rose up, dancing wildly in panic, as if it had been hit by a sonic cannon. The giant stork staggered in the air, almost falling down. Then it couldn't help but roll its eyes. Damn, why is it another pervert? No more? Oh, Huaishur smacked its lips, as if it hadn't had enough. It lay down again, and whispered to the construction team on its back, "You can continue." Then the busy construction continued. The construction started around yesterday morning. Fox, who had left and returned, came looking for Huaishur. He looked at the huge frame that had just been installed on Huaishur's back, pondered for a long time, and said that he had a plan. "Look, your body shape and your ability to bear weight, as well as the frame that had just been put on your back." Fox praised, "You're simply a natural cannon frame." "Sorry, I'm only 17. I don't know what you're talking about." Huaishur opened his eyes wide in shock, looking at Fox with an expression that said, "Uncle, you're a pervert." It almost made Fox spit out a mouthful of old blood, and he jumped up in anger. "What do you not know? You're only 17. How can you even dare to drive Uncle's car? And why do you drive even more smoothly than Uncle?" "I'm not joking." Fox choked and coughed for a long time, then said with wide eyes, "I'm talking about the literal meaning." "Oh." Huaishur stared blankly for a long time, then let out a sigh of relief. "I thought you had some unspeakable evil thoughts towards me." Fox was about to die from anger. "No matter how sick I am, I won't go so far as to make a move on you." "You're only 17. What are you thinking in your head every day? Hooking up with a rich woman?" Huaishur answered subconsciously, then immediately coughed awkwardly. "Ah, that's none of my business. Recently, everyone has been saying that you're a pervert." Well, the ignorant child Huaishur bluntly exposed the gossip behind the adult's back, making Fox's expression twitch faster and faster. "I'm not." "Oh, it doesn't matter if you are." Huaishur decisively stopped the topic, then asked, "What did you want to say just now?" "Cannon rack." "Don't you King mention that word." "Okay." Fox was about to vomit blood. "In short, there will be a construction team coming to find you later to modify the fixed frame on your back, and then a lot of heavy weapons will be installed on your body. With your ability to bear weight, it shouldn't be a problem. And then you'll be our artillery base." After saying that, he was afraid that Huaishur would say something else, so he turned around and left. "Oh, to be everyone's cannon rack. I know." Huaishur nodded seriously, then shouted at him confidently, "I'll work hard." Fox's back staggered, and he almost rolled down the road. Thanks to Huaishur's loud voice, before that night, everyone knew that the pervert Fox had gone to find a 17-year-old boy to talk about something that children shouldn't hear, and even had some unspeakable evil thoughts. The Phoenix silently looked at Fox for a long time. its eyes sad and helpless. After a long time, it sighed. Old Wu, I've known you for so many years, but I didn't expect you to be such a person. I'm not. I won't say anything more. When we get out, you can go and submit the self-reflection letter yourself. It seemed that it couldn't bear to say anything more, so it covered its face and left. Fox was left standing alone in the bleak vacuum, looking down at the ground below the city wall, and began to think, if I jump down from here, can I redeem my innocence? What was even more unbelievable was that its structure was completely different from other creatures. No, it should be said that it wasn't even considered a creature anymore. What is this? It was a moving piece of metal, steel, a moving furnace, and a dormant volcano. It was a monster that could deal with the apocalypse just by relying on its body size. It did not conform to the current laws of biology, nor did it follow all the laws that ordinary people knew. It was like a fairy tale that existed in the void. However, he walked out of his own story and came here, appearing in front of everyone. It was inconceivable. Even the creators in the outside world fell into silence. This was not a difference in performance and function, nor was there a difference in conception and creativity. It was that the starting point was completely different from theirs from the beginning. The creator behind Weisher did not create a living behemoth. What he sought was not rigorous scholarship that could be successfully replicated and falsified. He did not even consider whether the laws and regulations he weaved could be realized after leaving the unique environment of the Night of the Witch. Instead, he used the entire Night of the Witch as a stage. After all this was a trial performance, he created a character at will. He did not consider cause and effect, nor did he consider any elements that had nothing to do with his inspiration. He willfully wrote, cutting and correcting reality as he pleased. In the end, he extracted countless elements that he liked and buried them in the soil of reality, allowing them to grow wantonly. He did not ask for anything in return, did not care about the consequences, and did not expect anything else. It was a goal in itself. It was the answer written by the unknown creator, a story that was told with a burst of inspiration. Apart from the former utopia, was there anyone else who could be so proficient in the operation of the situation? Other than that group of lunatics who pursued a perfect world, where else would have such naive ideas and arrogant ideas? The creators in the outside world had once called the ivory tower to inquire, but the response they received was, without exception, silence or ambiguous responses. They did not deny it, but they also did not admit that any professor had participated in this Night of the Witch. However, there was no doubt that Weisher could be regarded as the work of the utopia. In order to welcome the return of this deceased colleague, those pioneers who had come to the end came here and invested in works of the same origin as her. This was their unique way of commemoration. And now, as hundreds of giant tower cranes were retracted, countless supports collapsed. Amidst the tremors of the earth, Weisher slowly got up and stretched his body slightly. The ear-piercing roar of steel friction burst forth. Dazzling sparks burst out from the gaps of the armor. As Weisher's movements became more violent, the earth quaked even more violently. Over his body, heavy steel blocks kept peeling off from the friction and collision, leaving no one able to stop him. But when the flying steel chips slowly fell, the armored steel behemoth was completely different from before. It was not just a difference in form and form, but as if it was welcoming another metamorphosis. At this point, as Weisher breathed, a vast amount of origin substance flowed between the armor and his body, connecting the welded steel to his body, so that there was no distinction between the two. Layers of scale-like patterns appeared over the flat armor, like the tendons and muscles left by a craftsman during forging. It was solemn, majestic, and so sharp that one could not look directly at it. In front of Weisher, the scholar on the tower could not help but take a few steps back, gulping dryly. Under the suppression of that ferocious presence, there was actually a hint of panic and regret in his heart. It was the doubt and uneasiness that would surface in the hearts of countless research fanatics when they sensed that the situation was not quite right. Was everything he was doing still under his control? If the present Huaishir showed the slightest hostility, the eternal Titan Empire would probably be reduced to ruins before the other behemoths could defeat him, even without the invasion of the corrosive species. He subconsciously wanted to touch the alarm button. Taking a deep breath, he raised the microphone and asked rather dryly, "How do you feel?" Amidst the uneasy silence, the giant amber eyes looked down at his present body. Huaishir grinned, revealing the most beautiful evil smile in movies and TV series, causing the scholar's heart to abruptly sink. Then his heart really did sink, because Huaishir said, "My butt is itchy. I want to scratch it. Can you take this thing apart first?" The scholar's expression twitched, and he looked at him in astonishment, with a blank look on his face. "Are you kidding, brother? It took more than 600 people and thousands of automatic machines 48 hours to put on this armor for you. How long have you been wearing it, and you want to take it off? Ha ha ha, you're scared, aren't you?" Huaishir laughed proudly, pointed at him, then shook his head and said, "I'm kidding. Well, although it's a little itchy, I can scratch it myself." As he said that, he lifted his sharp and heavy tail and scratched the scholars, but vigorously, causing a burst of blazing and dazzling sparks. Before the scholar could say anything, he heard his voice. "All of you, move back a little. The momentum will be a little louder later. Don't hurt anyone." So, soon, with the sharp sound of the alarm, all the evolved species in the construction site took the big bus and ran dozens of kilometers away. Then they saw that as Huaishir took a deep breath, traces of electric light emerged from his body again. In the blink of an eye, violent icy blue flashes shrouded his body, bursting out with his roar. In the countless low buzzing sounds like the buzzing of bees, a thick pillar of thunder suddenly rose from his body and soared into the sky. The thunder turned into a pillar of heaven, and the fanatical light of destruction illuminated this crazy world. It tore through the darkness and broke through the air in all directions, coldly lashing out at this world. The terrifying power was hundreds of times more than before. Just by slightly activating his own talent, it caused such a terrifying momentum. This terrifying increase did not come from Huaishir himself, but from the tens of thousands of complicated and huge Doomsday magnetic field engines under his armor at this moment. The careful design of the scholars had increased Huaishir's own destructive power to a level that even he himself could not imagine. However, this was not to kill the enemy, but to recharge the thousands of alchemy cannons on Huaishir's back that needed to be loaded by the train to be transported. There were 4 main cannons on the left and right rear, more than 80 secondary cannons, and thousands of secondary cannons installed in the center of the circuit to provide diversion. Today, Huaishir had become the strongest weapon of the Titan Empire, a mobile war fortress, an upgraded version of the war machine. Do you know? Huaishir stretched his body happily, sniffing the thin air that was gradually getting thicker, as if he had caught a glimpse of the gray tide roaring from thousands of miles away. "I'm actually starting to hope that they can come sooner." Streaks of dark blue lightning constantly flashed between his joints and the iron tower, leaving streaks of afterimages in the darkness. Just by getting close, he could feel the huge electrostatic field prickling his skin and hair. "How's the charging progress?" The Phoenix asked. "Not bad." Huaishir shook his head. "The resistance is still too high, although it can theoretically reach 150%. After reaching 120%, the speed of power loss is almost catching up with the speed of my charging. Other than a burst of power, there's not much use. That being said, the electricity carried by Huaishur at this moment was not inferior to a large thunderstorm. Once released at such a close distance, all the large facilities in the entire Titan Empire would be forced to close down in this terrible impact. But hasn't the technology been updated these 2 days? Why do we still need to use electricity? Huaishur asked curiously. I heard that many borders within the Astronomical Society have already adopted more advanced energy sources. Why haven't I seen it in the present realm? Because electricity is the most convenient. The maintenance engineer leading the team on Huaishur's back replied through the communication. Although the most advanced technology used in the present realm today is nuclear fission reactors to obtain electricity in addition to primitive firepower, wind power, and water power. In fact, in the frontier experiments of scholars, it's not just nuclear fusion and nuclear fusion at room temperature. Even the relevant laws of vacuum zero-point energy have begun to be explored. There are about 7 or 8 types of energy sources more advanced than electricity. The places you mentioned should be independent institutions that have a high energy demand but are not suitable for long-term communication with the outside world. For a series of reasons such as confidentiality or internal security, they have to get rid of their dependence on the outside world, so they use other energy sources. These examples are not applicable to the present realm. In the classification of energy science today, the most perfect, stable, and trustworthy is still electrodynamics, which has been developed for nearly 600 years. Every detail of electrodynamics has been revised by generations of scholars and creators to the greatest extent to conform to the 3 major blockades. After the 4 fundamental forces are established, it has even achieved the mutual transformation of electricity and the past magic to a certain extent. The maintenance of the present realm is a law that, if hastily written into other energy sources, once there are conflicts in the details of the regulations, it might lead to unexpected tragic situations. If there are too many strange mods that are incompatible, Little Butter will collapse, right? Huaishur nodded and tried to understand the situation from a strange perspective. She suddenly realized something. I understand now. On his back, the engineer who was climbing the tower almost slipped and fell from above. He did not catch his breath, and his pale green goblin face turned red. Evil creature, what do you understand now? But before he could reply, an ear-piercing alarm sounded from the sky, and the pale light of the steel satellite instantly turned blood red. In the shrill sound of the air defense alarm, emergency shelters sounded from all over the city. If it were any other place, in the face of such a hasty alarm, it would definitely cause a great commotion, right? But in the metal city, everyone was like layers of gears embedded together, moving quickly and orderly, full of the beauty of machinery. For the explorers, the tribe they developed was no different from their own hands, eyes, and feet. No matter where the tribe was and what situation they were in, they would unconditionally obey the orders of the tribe leader, even if the orders were cruel, heartless, or contrary to nature. Under the command of the central control, all the members orderly entered the shelters or wore fortifications in batches, using transportation, elevators, and even walking. They were on standby. It's here. The 6-winged, undying bird suddenly spread its wings and soared into the air. Hanging high in the sky, it emitted boundless light. In the blink of an eye, a fleeting sun appeared in this world, illuminating every inch of land and darkness. It revealed the gray tide that was sweeping from the distance. Huaishur had expected the gray tide to slowly flood over, but what he saw now was completely different from what he had imagined. The earth was shaking and roaring. The rumbling of trillions of corrosive species turned into the loud rumble of the tide. But it did not look like seawater, but like a rapidly growing carpet rolling over the land, seemingly slow but actually swift as thunder. Looking into the distance, there was no end in sight. All that could be seen were huge silhouettes slowly emerging from the depths of the gray tide and ferocious limbs dancing. Countless blood-red eyes, like bubbles on the seawater, flowers that grew out of fungus after the rain, kept emerging from the tide of the abyss. Every corrosive species, big or small, was already emaciated under the torture of hunger and desolation, and looked as if they would fall dead on the spot. But now there was a fanatical light in their eyes. Countless scarlet eyes gathered in one place, and Huaisher could not help but shudder. He finally understood what it was like to be the enemy of the entire hell. But there was no one to thank for the invitation. Wait a minute. The undying bird's deep voice sounded in the ears of every giant beast. Suppressing the ferocity of the giant beasts deep in their blood, it said, "Wait a little longer." Huaisher took a deep breath, and terrifying heat gushed out from the gap under the armor. In an instant, it turned into an oven in the darkness. Blue flames kept emerging from his mouth and nose, bursting out. The undying bird's deep voice continued, echoing between heaven and earth, covering the terrifying tide from afar. "Don't worry, it's not time yet," it said, "so we have to wait." Even if the earth rumbled, the gray tide had already entered within 100 miles. Looking down from the sky, the huge steel capital was as small as a speck of dust, and the dark tide in all directions could not see the end. Such a huge disparity brought about a piercing sense of crisis that made all the giant beasts wander on the edge of madness. His eyes burned brightly, bursting with a blazing light. Wait a little longer. A golden halo like a sun appeared around the undying bird's body, restraining the endless flames in its body. It was a cruel power that seemed to be born from the essence of thermodynamics. When the gray tide was close and within 10 miles, a sharp sound like the roar of steel burst out from the deepest part of the city. It was a signal from the central control room. In the shortest way, in the most straightforward and efficient way, the roar of the cannon, the prelude to the war, was opened at that moment. There was no need for anyone to urge. The roar of the giant beasts burst out from the earth, and the sound of tearing the tide turned into thunder and soared into the sky. The six-winged undying bird was faster than everyone else. At this moment, the giant bird, who usually looked no different from the other members, was already at the top of the sky. It was as if he was sitting on his own throne. 16 golden halos emerged from his body, and the power from the essence of thermodynamics burst out from his 6 wings. The intense light instantly spread in all directions, covering everything within hundreds of miles. Then a tyrannical heat emerged from the light, and in an instant, all the invaders were turned into ashes. It was like a high-temperature spray, gun burning away an insignificant hair, and not even ashes were left. As the earth cracked, the soil was also burned, turning into a fiery red slurry that flowed everywhere. The sun that had not been seen for a long time once again came to this hell, but this time it did not bestow kindness to all living beings, but a terrible disaster of light that burned everything to ashes. There was no need for others to do anything. Under exquisite control, the terrible heat did not even hurt a single ally. The radiance disappeared as soon as it was released. Immediately, the world was plunged into darkness again. After a brief setback, the endless gray tide only paused for a moment before it swept forward again. Thus, the sun spread out again. The flames of destruction swept through the surroundings, and the destruction fell again, shrinking back into the corona. The gray tide went deeper and deeper, and the sun spread out again. The tyrannical and huge power seemed to be endless. Not only were the leaders hidden in the gray tide stunned, but even the allies were already stunned. What kind of operation is this? The Taurus was dumbfounded. He only said to make others wait, but he is collecting heads himself. Where did this malignant tumor come from? After 10 times, the flames swept across the earth like a plow, completely turning the area within 1,000 miles into a scorching hell of raging lava. At this moment, the undying bird was still hanging high above the steel city, sprinkling light and illuminating the entire battlefield, continuously replenishing the heat of the lava. However, the terrible power that swept through the acupoints like a plow just now did not appear again. It seemed to have reached its limit, but it also seemed like it had not. No one could see any clues from his unfathomable eyes. He was only spreading the most basic heat to maintain this infernal inferno that was thousands of miles wide. That was enough for him. In the endless gray tide, more than 60% of the corrosive species were weak and dying. They could not resist the heat from the undying bird at all, and were burned to ashes as soon as they entered, turning into firewood in hell. In other words, just the undying bird alone was enough to withstand 60% of the trillions of corrosive species. The rest is up to you. The calm voice of the undying bird rang in the ears of every explorer. I will support you at any time. At this moment, the calm and deep voice gave everyone endless confidence. It was as if they really had to lean against the sun. Their fighting spirit was aroused. And what was faster than their words were the wild dogs that had broken free of their reins. Amidst the sudden rumbling of the earth, hurricanes howled and swept across the land, setting off waves of lava that were several stories tall. Bichimos, its forelegs trampling on the flames, had already dashed out. It roared excitedly at the sky. Hey, I want to eat a hot dog. Chapter 369. Hungry. Hungry. If one had to describe it, it would be super unparalleled hunger. For the first time, Huaishur felt such an urgent and strong sense of hunger after completing the deification transformation. It was as if he had not eaten for 10 years. He could indeed eat stones, iron, ore, and molten iron without any problems. But how could that kind of non-nutritious cornbread compare to barbecued meat? At this moment, someone was continuously barbecuing a whole lamb, a whole cow, a whole kidney, a large intestine, and a squid tentacle in front of him. Although there was still a little cumin missing, there was already an internal taste. Smelling the burnt aroma from afar, Huaishur's saliva had already left his mouth. He could not wait. After seeing the undying bird collect so many heads, the desire to fight in his blood did not emerge. Instead, a strong sense of admiration rose. Someone had actually set up a barbecue rack for him. What was he waiting for? Go, go, go. The cafeteria was ready to eat. Huaishur dashed forward wildly, ignoring the oncoming black tide. He ran straight toward the huge figure in the gray tide, the corrosive species that looked like a giant wild boar. It was as if he was not looking at an enemy, but a roasted hot dog with 4 legs. What appeared on his face was not ferocious and murderous, but an appetite that made the corrosive species shudder. Seeing him running toward it with his tongue and saliva, the giant wild boar paused and almost instinctively wanted to run back. However, the gray tide was turbulent and pushed it forward. It could not run away. As for Huaishur, she was getting closer and closer when it turned back. The ferocity and hunger had disappeared, replaced by a strong sense of despair in its eyes. Don't come over. Then, Huaishur came over, trampling on the gray tide under his feet. He bent down, grabbed the beast that was as big as a small mountain, lifted it, and threw it into the air. Then, he opened his mouth and closed it with a howl. It was just enough for one bite. He felt the delicious gravy burst out of his mouth. The fatty and sweet pork mixed with the lava juice burst out with a stunning and wonderful taste. Huaishur was almost moved to tears. When he lowered his head again, he realized that the sea of gray corrosive species that was everywhere like a tidal wave had suddenly parted to form a huge gap in front of him. It was as if they had encountered an invisible obstacle. The moment they saw Huaishur, they ran wildly to the sides, then gathered behind him and ran forward. I don't want to play with him anymore. What should I do? Huaishur was dumbfounded. I seemed to be isolated. No one spoke to him. They were too lazy to bother with him. You can't afford to play, right? Huaishur was furious. On the back of the armor, countless huge cannons stood upright and aimed in all directions. 2nd Battalion Commander, fire! I'll say it again. I'm not your F*King 2nd Battalion Commander. A terrifying electric current suddenly rose from the top of the tower, baring its fangs and brandishing its claws in the air, converging into a faint shadow of a thundercloud. It was the Taurus constellation that had already transformed into energy. Then, a ferocious smile appeared on the thundercloud. But I have no objections to firing the cannons. At that moment, the ground under Huaishur's feet suddenly shook. He was smashed down dozens of meters by the huge recoil. The ground cracked, and his 4 huge claws were almost buried in the soil. Thousands of streaks of light had already gushed out along with the frenzied thunder, rising and falling like stars. The origin substance turned into heavy metal, instantly ejecting and accelerating wildly in the thousands of electromagnetic fields, reaching a terrifying speed that was difficult for the naked eye to follow. The moment they left the chamber, their terrifying size began to rapidly vaporize, leaving behind glaring traces of metal steam wherever they passed. The sharp cannonballs had already pierced into the tide, leaving behind radiating traces that extended hundreds of kilometers into the gray tide. The corrosive species that were hit by the cannonballs nearby vaporized before they could even wail. In the middle distance, they would explode into a rain of blood and be torn apart by the wind, forming a scarlet mist in the silver metal steam. On the other hand, the unlucky ones furthest away had huge wounds dug out of their bodies. Shortly after, the metal shards in their wounds exploded, disintegrating into the purest metal mist. Half of their bodies were instantly charred, and they collapsed to the ground. Huaishur stepped forward and roared at the sky. Blazing lightning rose again, converging into the tower continuously. Under the control of the Taurus constellation, it was evenly and quickly distributed to every giant cannon that had been preheated. 1/3 was cooling, 1/3 was preparing, and 1/3 was preheating. It was simply a reproduction of the 3-stage shooting style of the era of queuing and shooting. With the support of almost unlimited firepower, the moving cannon formation rumbled forward. Step by step, they walked out of the range of the lava, charging into the depths of the gray tide. When Huaishur felt tired, he would breathe and gulp down the sediment from the abyss. When he was thirsty, he would open his mouth and receive the rain of blood that kept falling from the sky. The aura of the abyss, which made the leaders of a large group pale in comparison, emerged from his body, almost causing people to mistake him for the same kind. But now, the biggest traitor in the Night of the Witch was ready to kill his own kind. On his back, the cannon formation constantly changed its position, completely ignoring the small fries around it, and began to focus on the huge threats in the gray tide. The effect was outstanding. This was Huaishur's mission. Using his own strong resistance to hell, he broke away from the group to attract the attention of the enemy to the greatest extent, relieving the pressure on his allies in the defense circle. In other words, he was a target. But other than Huaishur, who was as huge as a mountain, whose armor was so thick that even cannons could not penetrate it, and whose life was so tough that he would not die even if the end of the world came, who else could complete such a mission? What's more, there was a teammate with the strongest explosive power assisting from the side. At this moment, the completely electrified Taurus was constantly flying from the huge tower behind Huaishur, falling into the metal city, and then wrapped in a huge amount of electric current in the energy furnace, returning again and starting a new round of crazy output. Instant spring water, instant manna, and skills without cooldown. It was like cheating. For it, there was no problem of the burden of the other behemoths. It itself was energy. In other words, as long as it was willing, it could even hit itself out. Under the unlimited supply of the 6 reactors in the central city, it had been a long time since it used its power so heartily. Even after being sleepy for a long time, it became a little drunk. It fell into a state of excitement and madness. Oh, I'm the Lightning King. Surrounded by dozens of crazy thunderbolts, the snake-shaped electric current wrapped around the huge tower laughed wildly and scattered destruction. Accept Uncle Bull's correction. Speaking of which, you're not a bull at all, are you? Why are you called Taurus? Why sure was running amok in the crowd of monsters, even having the time to turn back and chat. It's just that after using the ecliptic prototype of creator Kingertai, it's called Taurus. It's just a code name. It doesn't matter what you're called. Why sure's eyes widened and asked angrily, then why can't I be called 2nd Battalion Commander? Taurus was also stunned for a moment and was a little embarrassed and immediately retorted irritably, anyway, you can't. Okay, why sure pursed her lips. Our independent regiment only has 2 people. I don't have any objections to you being the commander of the 1st Battalion, but let me say this first. I can't give my position as regiment commander to you. Do I care? Taurus felt that if it had not been energy transformed long ago, it would have been so angry that it would have vomited blood. Also, be careful in front. Huaisher was stunned and suddenly turned back, feeling the thin air suddenly ripple, and a giant snake full of barbs and eyes suddenly rushed out of the gray tide, its huge body pouncing towards him. Huaisher only had time to take a deep breath, and then the giant snake was gone. After being evenly smeared with a layer of metal steam and heated up, it was turned into charcoal grilled snake segments, crispy and rich. Huaisher finished eating, and only felt that the Taurus next door was crying. I didn't. Taurus was furious. How did you know what I was thinking? I beg you, turn off the free mic. Taurus was completely helpless. We're still on the same channel. Can't you stop thinking? Why didn't you say so earlier? I would have cut the song. Huaisher's eyes lit up, and he switched to the public channel, turned on the colorful backlight behind him, and simply set the BGM in his heart, singing and dancing hot, and dancing in the gray tide. So, in the harsh noise pollution, everyone began to feel that there was nothing left to live for in the rich orchard atmosphere. Fortunately, as Huaisher went deeper and deeper, the mental pollution was getting farther and farther away, and he could use his subjective will to block it and pretend that he could not hear it. But even if Huaisher ran forward with all his strength for half an hour, and even if he could run back to Pingan County from Zhaozhuang by walking, he still could not see the end of the gray tide. The whole world seemed to be drowned by the erosion seed. If it were not for the sun hanging high behind him, he would almost be lost in this eternal gray and black disturbance. Even the irascible Taurus could not help but feel a trace of powerlessness. How many have we killed? 8,000? 10,000? 100,000? Huaisher couldn't even calculate how many enemies she could kill with a single round of cannon fire. But even after being bombarded with nuclear bombs for days on end, the number of enemies was still endless. It was as if there was no end to them. And as Huaisher went deeper, in the depths of the gray tide, a ferocious silhouette finally slowly emerged. A half-rotten giant bird rose from the darkness, condensing its own fleeting silhouette like a mist of nothingness. And as the single wing, which was full of tumors and aberrations, slowly rose, it gave people the illusion that it covered the whole world. After the gray tide, the master of the swarm finally appeared. He made a prompt decision and fired a round of artillery fire. However, When the hot metal cannonballs landed on its wings, they only added an insignificant layer of molten iron to its dull gray feathers. As the wings shook, the iron liquid was shaken off like water. Then, behind and to the right of Huaishur, two huge figures that seemed to be condensed by the darkness appeared, slowly moving forward, trying to surround him. "Be careful, they want to keep us here." Taurus looked around and reminded in a low voice, "Let's retreat first and bring back information about them. If we get entangled by them, we might be exhausted to death." Huaishur had a different opinion about this. "You have to think positively." He swallowed his saliva and stared at the giant shadow bird in the distance. As he spread his arms, the hymn sounded again. The hammer of misery was raised again, excitedly aiming at the stunned master of the swarm. "At least I have enough chicken wings." Bichimos shouted excitedly. A roar burst forth. The buffet of the abyss had begun. Chapter 370. It was clearly a raging gray tide, but at this moment, a deathly silence suddenly descended. Under the murderous intent between the leaders of the large groups, all living things were intimidated and retreated in fear. But at this moment, under the encirclement of the three leaders of the large groups, the prey did not panic or struggle as expected. It was so strange. With the wisdom bestowed by the abyss, it could clearly distinguish that the appearance at this moment was not one of fear, seriousness, or battle intent. It just calmly raised its hammer, as if it was raising a table knife. It was full of gratitude for the food. "Are you ready?" The wolf beast grinned and smiled. A dangerous aura spread, from the burst of electric light. In an instant, the 3 leaders of the large groups could not help but become cautious and ready for battle. Even the Taurus did not expect him to be so stubborn. He only remembered to shout, "Hey, don't!" But then they heard a roar. A loud noise burst forth. It was as if the sky was falling and the earth was splitting. Sure disappeared from where he was, as if he had evaporated. Then, the thin air also wailed, bursting with thunder under the whip of electric light. The shadow of a mountain had already shrouded the face of the giant shadow bird. Against the fanatical electric light, the wolf beast smiled mockingly and raised the hammer in his hand. "Whether you are ready or not," it said, "I am ready." Boom! With terrifying speed, unparalleled pain, and weight operated in the hands of Bichimos. With a violent swing, it smashed downwards without any fancy moves. The sky fell. Since becoming Bichimos, this was the first time Sure used the technique of U-steps. Its body, which was originally so huge and cumbersome, was now as agile as a phantom. In an instant, it crossed a distance of several kilometers. As if descending from the sky, it arrived in front of the shadow crow. It raised its hammer and smashed downwards. There was no need for any other moves or techniques. As long as he put all his strength, as long as he put all his weight on this hammer, it would be enough. That was enough. Again, with the dazzling plasma jet spurting out, mournful lightning wrapped around the hammer the size of an office building, causing the falling steel to accelerate, and accelerate again. It tore through layers of darkness and smashed on the single wing that it had hurriedly raised. It was as if he had crushed a bubble. He easily smashed the wings that he had raised, breaking them into 2 pieces. Then, he continued to descend with irresistible force. In the middle of the stunned beast's face, bum, the wail of bones breaking could be heard, followed by a series of wails from the spinal cord and an unbearable explosion. When the loud sound spread out, countless clouds of dust were stirred up. Strands of violent electric light tore through the darkness, illuminating the tragic silhouette. Under the bombardment of the hammer, it had already tilted up like a broken piece of wood. Its head was deeply buried in the cracks of the ground, and its twitching body stood upright, still convulsing in pain. Immediately after, Bichimos raised his foot and stomped on it. He stretched out his hand, and a teeth-numbing, tearing sound rang out. It tore off its giant wings and opened its mouth to spit out flames, instantly cooking it. Sure tossed it into his mouth and chewed it twice before spitting out the burnt feathers. He smacked his lips and pondered for a moment before spitting disdainfully. Mediocre. Taurus could feel the non-existent corners of his eyes twitching. He couldn't help but say, "It's already smashed into meat paste. The taste can't be good no matter how you think about it." "That's true." Sure nodded seriously. He waved his hand to disperse the hammer of agony and pulled out the axe of wrath and the sacrificial blade. The blades scraped against each other, causing sparks to burst out amidst the teeth-numbing metallic sound. In the fleeting flash, he grinned at the remaining 2 prey. "I'll be more careful next time." In that instant, the remaining 2 huge corrosive species involuntarily took a step back. They saw the astonishment, unconcealable fear, and dread in each other's eyes. Behind them, in the direction of the metal city, a crimson light suddenly rose. "Stop fooling around." Sure? It's a distress signal." Taurus' tone turned serious. Sure stared blankly for a moment before he resentfully put away his axe. "Okay, I'll go now." "No, hurry up." Sure raised his eyebrows happily and whistled at the 2 corrosive species. "I'll try my best." The gray tide seemed to be about to drown the city. Even the giant beasts were helpless against the endless numbers. At this moment, layers of ice-cold water curtains rose. enveloping the entire city in defense. But above the vault of heaven, there was also an endless gray tide. They were flying birds, flying in flocks like termites preying on food. They were a tide of disaster that constantly flew out from the shattered clouds. The winged serpent was already entangled with the undying bird. Even in the gray tide, this strange giant beast was at the forefront. It constantly shuttled through space, flickering and jumping out. Poisonous clouds were emitted from its body, covering most of the sky and sprinkling down the fierce poison of the abyss. In the heavy encirclement, the shadow of a 9-headed serpent slowly rose above the metal city. Its 9 heads hissed, and its huge body emitted astonishing waves of origin substance. Immediately after, a storm of steel fell from the sky. Wherever the slender and sharp cold light passed, even the giant serpent's sturdy body, which was strong enough to resist the sun wheel, was pierced through. Under the origin substance, countless strange runes appeared on the sharp metal, causing the steel to retract into spear-like nails. They gathered in groups like piranhas and shuttled through the battlefield. Ashnail, Fox, who was watching from the top of the city wall, put down his binoculars and was dumbfounded. The thousands of cold metallic lights were formed by countless relics from the border. The sharp blades carried the invincible blessing and the curse of the bloody soul double kill. The miracle from the depths of hell reappeared here. Among the 4,100 formulas announced so far, it was the vicious weapon ranked 11th among the cursed blades, the ash nail. At this moment, more than tens of thousands had been refined by Hydra. Even if it was incomparable to the divine power of the main body as an ordinary mass-produced model, it still displayed an unimaginably terrifying effect at this moment. As expected of Garland Dion's disciple, Fox exclaimed from the bottom of his heart, other than forging miracle stigmata and magic potions in the furnace, what alchemists were best at was the reappearance of the disaster of the abyss at this moment. Currently, there were already more than 4,000 formulas of relics from the border that had been announced for all alchemists to pay for. It was like rubbing, using the prototype as the basis, and carrying out mass-produced replicas. Even if it could only be preserved for a short period of time, it was still a great undertaking that could recreate miracles. However, to refine tens of thousands of ash nail in one go, no matter how powerful a genius was, they would still be drained of their origin substance, right? If it wasn't for the body of a giant beast at this moment, Gullilu would have been completely drained and burned to ashes by the 3rd time. Tens of thousands of ash-returning nails whizzed across the battlefield. Wherever the metal hurricane passed by, everything was cleanly crushed, turning into ashes that filled the sky. At the same time, the dual attack and extermination targeted the physical body and origin substance. The wounds caused by them couldn't be healed at all. Even if they didn't die, they would turn into ashes in the continuous loss of blood and origin substance. Everything turned to ashes. It was as if the world had been burned to ashes. The storm of steel swept through like a plow, and the gray tide was cruelly overturned. Countless ashes flew out, rising from the magma hurricane and turning into dancing flames. Cracking sounds constantly rang out from the storm, echoing on the battlefield. When the last ash nail shattered into rust in the air, there was no longer any corrosive species within 100 miles of the city. Only the ashes of embers were left, slowly flying in the air. The fox clapped excitedly. Encore, 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 do it again. Do it my ass. The dispirited Hyride spat out a mouthful of green spittle. The snake had shrunk by a large circle. I can't hold on any longer. It doesn't matter anymore. An impassioned voice rang out from the public channel, accompanied by loud laughter. If you want to ask why, it's because I'm here. Thousands of lightning bolts shot out from the depths of the gray tide, crisscrossing and instantly tearing a huge crack in the pitch-black ocean. The earth roared. The mountain-like behemoth galloped on the battlefield, constantly trampling the gray tide under its feet, but there was still half a rib in its mouth. It was like a female high school student who went out in a hurry in the morning. But this time, the female high school student's figure and image were a little too scary. Huaishur charged out of the rain of blood with a flurry of swords, axes, and hammers. Her speed increased once again, accompanied by an impassioned hymn. Sharp electric currents appeared on the rainbow halo, making the hymn sound even more punk than it already was. With the help of lightning, Huaishur ran forward, swinging the axe and hammer in his hand with all his strength, and threw them at the big snake in the sky. With a loud sound, the axe and hammer drew an arc in the air, and the burning steel disappeared at the end of the darkness. Crooked. His aim was as crooked as the Nicaragua Trench. In the awkward silence, Huaishur coughed. "Sorry, I didn't hit. Then why the hell are you shouting?" In an instant, all the behemoths rolled their eyes. Then they saw Huaishur bending over in the turbulent gray tide. The fanatical electric light enveloped his body, and he was wearing a thunderous robe. He put on a charging posture, raised his head, and showed a reassuring, honest smile on his dog's head. "I'm the Flash." The fox was stunned for a moment, as if it had thought of something. It suddenly panicked, but it was too late to stop it. The next moment, the knockoff Flash moved his forelegs, and under the acceleration of the quadruple U steps, the wild dog, who was off the leash, set off a hurricane in the midst of the earth-shaking, earth-shattering noise and rushed toward the metal city. "It's over." The fox raised its hand and patted its face, its heart cold. It was finally going to tear down the house. Chapter 371. Imagine that one day a husky appears next to your model. Every day, it would look at your work with a dangerous gaze, as if it had not had enough activity for the day. When you were not paying attention, it would drool at your model. It was eager to try. From then on, day after day, you hovered on the edge of mental and physical exhaustion. But you could not beat it, until one day you see it grinning wickedly, opening its mouth, and running happily towards your model. The first thing you feel is not fear or panic, but a sense of relief that says, this day has finally come. It was like a death row prisoner seeing the executioner who had been suffering from diarrhea finally return to the execution ground. It was a relief. Hurry up and give me a quick death. Now, it was time for a quick death, accompanied by a roar that shook the earth and mountains. The 1,000-mile infernal inferno also stirred up waves in this violent tremor. Huaishur had already rushed over, with electric light, its tongue hanging out, and its huge eyes staring at the big snake in the sky. It was so focused that it did not notice the trembling steel city directly in front of it. The huge shadow of a mountain had already shrouded the trembling Titan empire. On the city wall, Fox only had time to scream in horror one last time. Huaishur, no! The next moment, the roar had already erupted from the front. It was the explosion of thunder tearing through the air. The thin air was ravaged and suddenly squeezed inwards, colliding together, and then retreating to the sides with a whine, repeatedly shaking, just like the gel used for gun testing under the high-speed camera. On the ground, there were already 4 uniform and deep depressions. The huge force gathered into a beam and went straight to the ground several kilometers below, and then it exploded with a bang. In the end, it succeeded in triggering a chaotic earthquake, adding a new scar to the geological environment that was already riddled with holes under the city. Because the super giant Flash had already exerted force on its 4 limbs and soared into the air, towards the sky, flying straight out. Only its excited voice echoed in the whining wind. "I can fly." It was like a miracle. The out-and-out mountain-level monster had broken free from the shackles of the earth, and so willfully soared in the wind, grinning and swinging its tongue as it flew higher. Higher up, the immortal bird tangled in the battle was so scared that its eyes were wide open. It could not care less about defense, and flapped its wings desperately to increase its altitude. Immersed in the battle, the big snake was completely unaware of the danger behind it. It was still fully focused on attacking the immortal bird, until it finally heard an excited roar from the turbulent void behind it. It turned back in shock. It saw a black shadow in the 8 huge eyes, growing bigger and bigger, until finally a huge dog's mouth filled its vision. Meow, meow. It was as if hundreds of thousands of question marks had risen from the abyss at the same time, filling the earth. In the next moment, Bichimos, who could no longer maintain its upward momentum, grabbed the tip of the tail of the giant serpent. Bichimos exerted all its strength and clenched it tightly. Together with its enormous mass, it fell downwards. In its haste, it only had time to let out a shrill cry that sounded like the cries of countless people. And then, together with Huaishur, Flash and Flash Flash and Flash Flash, all members, Fox, who was lucky enough to escape the disaster, raised its head. When it saw the shadow falling rapidly from the sky, its face turned green, and it screamed at the top of its lungs. Prepare for earthquake resistance. Before its voice died away, the earth in the distance was like a cesspool that welcomed firecrackers, a diving pool that was poisoned by fatties, or an online game server after the release of a new version. It exploded. Countless Geiger counters were beeping. All observation methods showed that at the center of the explosion, at the moment of the explosion, there was a phenomenon equivalent to nuclear fission with a yield of thousands of tons. A nuclear bomb. Fox's face now looked like a giant character in an American comic from hundreds of years ago, completely green. Before it could say anything, a terrifying shock swept over along with a hurricane. The entire earth instantly turned into a cruel and tyrannical ocean, setting off layers of ripples. The rock stratum was shaking like a carpet, tossing the metal creation that was the size of a coin above it. Everyone felt as if they had been lifted into the air at a certain moment. Then, they fell heavily to the ground amidst the wailing of countless hydraulic valves. The giant stork screeched and widened its eyes to maintain the soft, earthquake-resistant layer that could support the entire city. Blood oozed out of its 7 orifices. The enormous pressure felt as if the entire city was crashing down on its body. When Fox finally crawled out from behind the city wall with his face covered in dust, he stuck his head out to look outside the city, and finally couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air. SH*T, 100 kilometers away from the south of the city, where Huaishur had landed, there were already 3 rocky mountains rising from the empty ground. And in the rising smoke and lava, the terrain had been permanently changed. The crumpled blanket was no longer the proof of the past. Right at the center of the explosion, the huge gray tide had disappeared without a trace. In the mess of death and injury, there were several deep pits formed by intersecting rifts. In the deepest part of the pit, the giant snake that had been split in the middle of its spine could no longer make its original cry. At this moment, its body had been cut into countless pieces, and it weakly let out a series of whimpers. To be able to take this move of mine, one chi of mountains and rivers, you're not bad. Huaishur, who had a concussion, crawled out from the pit and shook his head. He lifted it up as if nothing had happened and punched it in the stomach again. Another part of it was broken. The giant snake was in pain, and its whimpers came to an abrupt end. It let out a shrill cry again, so shrill. A thick poisonous cloud gushed out from the wound and enveloped the deep pit. The terrifying corrosiveness even made Huaishur feel a stinging pain. His eyes, ears, mouth, and nose were burning. What was even more terrifying was that he felt a wave of weakness and exhaustion. He was poisoned. There was actually poison that could still work on him. Despicable, you actually poisoned me. Huaishir panted violently and inhaled even more poisonous gas. He felt that the symptoms of being poisoned were getting worse and worse. He really had no choice but to fight poison with poison. He lifted the giant snake, opened his mouth wide, and fiercely bit down. There was a crunch. The giant snake spasmed violently, and in the end, it let out a scream and no longer made any sound. It was thoroughly dead. Then, Huaishir's metal breath swept across and dispersed the poisonous cloud. Even though he couldn't breathe much air, he still felt a wave of freshness. He looked down at the snake corpse that was gradually losing its temperature in his hand and suddenly felt a sense of urgency. I have to write quickly, or it won't taste good when it's cold. The original soup turned into the original food. I have to make use of it while it's hot. He completely forgot that this corpse contained an unknown amount of abyss sediment and fierce poison. Just like a blue bottle, he slurped it up madly. He finally felt full. He skillfully spat out the bones in his mouth and burped. Only then did he realize that his body seemed to have grown bigger. Thinking that he was still 17 years old and was still growing, it was normal for him to develop occasionally. He didn't take this matter to heart at all. Then he heard a loud noise behind him. Within the metal city, shrill screams suddenly rang out from dozens of shelters. Huge holes suddenly appeared in the void, and endless abyssal precipitates swept out, forming a tide. Then a strange corrosive species that looked like a worm slowly poked its head out from inside. It pounced on the crowd with its big mouth full of sharp teeth. It was like a meat grinder had been opened, instantly spurting out countless amounts of blood. No one had expected such a terrifying change in such a hurry. The worm that was rapidly shuttling through space constantly opened up cracks one after another, and the gray tide continuously poured into the city. Its strangely long body crazily shuttled through the city like a parasite. Its body stirred wildly, causing the huge reactor in the center of the city to explode. Then there was another loud noise. It was the sound of the depth equalizer exploding. In an instant, everyone's expression became extremely ugly. The Taurus didn't even have time to greet them, and quickly soared into the sky, rushing into the smoke-filled city. But it was too late. The gravity from hell had already burst out from the center of the city, and the depth dropped crazily. Countless sediment flew up and enveloped all the surviving races. Horrifying distortion and erosion were about to descend. And then all the explorers who still had the time to pay attention to the situation in the city couldn't help but be stunned. Indeed, the erosion and distortion from hell spread in the city, but it didn't instantly cover everything like the expected explosion, but instead, it seemed to be blocked by some invisible force. Even if there was infiltration, it was still sealed in a certain area, and the focus of the disease couldn't be transferred. It was as if an invisible hand was pushing countless frightened souls, connecting them together in the same place, and the instinct and will to survive burst out, condensing into a substance. It was simply a miracle. Under the cover of the thin and almost imperceptible fog, the majority of the abyss erosion was isolated outside. Even if this layer of protection was so thin and insignificant, it was still an existence that made the difference between something and nothing. Miraculously, under the abyss tide, the erosion was stopped from spreading. A full 6 seconds. A miraculous 6 seconds. And when the hydra that caught its breath suddenly drilled out from the core, its 9 big mouths had already opened crazily, roaring, "Desolate Emperor!" The huge jellyfish returned from the battlefield, countless tentacles curling, fiddling with the air, forming a violent rain, instantly enveloping the entire city. Like the 7 seas bursting the dike, the torrent dissolved all the abyss sediment, turning it into a black tide. And under the Hydra's violent swallowing, all of it was absorbed into the Hydra's big mouth. Not a single drop was left. After swallowing the countless amounts of abyss sediment, the Hydra struggled to curl its swollen body, entangling itself with the strange worm, its 9 mouths tearing at its flesh above its metal teeth. A miracle from alchemy wedged into the worm's body, bringing about an instant of rigidity, like a tug of war. The Hydra struggled to pull it out, flung it up, and flew into the air. There was no need to say anything. The thunderstorm formed by the Taurus constellation instantly swallowed it, and as more than half of the thunderclouds dissipated, the worm had disappeared without a trace, leaving only a burnt smell and flying ashes falling from the sky. At this moment, the Taurus constellation had already shrunk a few times, as thin as an electric arc, unable to maintain its existence. Without saying anything, it threw itself into the remaining reactor. On the verge of death, after the worms were annihilated, the cracks in the void closed up and disappeared. Although there was still chaos in the city, the source had been contained, and restoring stability was only a matter of time. Finally, it took a step back from the cliff of destruction. But the Hydra was stunned on the spot. It stiffly lowered its head and saw its body that was slowly changing color, as if it was rotting, quickly turning black, and constantly growing strange tentacles and limbs. It was being eroded. "Is there still time?" the fox asked. The Hydra shook its head with difficulty, forcing a smile. "No, I'm afraid. Sorry, you have completed your mission. No need to say anything more." The fox lowered its eyes. "Goodbye?" "Okay." While it still had its reason, the Hydra struggled to swim out of the city and came in front of Huai Shi. It raised its head, which had grown tentacles and sarcomas, and grinned. "Sorry to trouble you. Isn't this part of my job?" Huai Shi was silent for a moment, and the axe of wrath quickly appeared in his hand. Seeing the blade, an axe slowly raised. Even though the Hydra was already prepared, it still could not help but panic. "Hey, be careful. Don't worry." Huai Shi comforted it. "I often do this. It's very nimble." Gulialu was amused. "Nonsense! Who would chop off the head of their teammates all day long?" Before he finished his words, the blade of the axe burst out, and dozens of crisscrossing cold lights burst out in the air, flashing and disappearing. The giant snake stiffened on the spot, its lips slightly opened, as if it was silently admiring. "Well done." It slowly closed its eyes and turned into ashes without a care in the world. This was the first explorer to leave after the arrival of the apocalypse. Chapter 372. The second diamond leopard to die. Although he often bickered with Bluebird, their relationship was actually quite good. Ever since they came here, they had been traveling together. In order to save Bluebird, that guy risked his life to fight against 5 of them. After bringing Bluebird back, he was already on the verge of death and couldn't hold on for long. In the end, Huai Shi came back again. This was part of his mission. Among all of them, his abyssal resistance was the highest. According to his calculations, even if everyone was turned into corrosive species, he could still live well. Besides, his skills were good. He was the only one who could do this kind of work. The third person to die was a guy who usually didn't talk much. That huge bat had pounced on the central engine unit and forcibly blocked the second wave of attacks. When he was rescued, his whole body was almost burnt to a crisp. After that, Huai Shi could finally say goodbye to this uncomfortable mission. Although the war was not over, the situation was already under control. 9 hours later, the border satellite has finally detected the edge of the gray tide. Fox, whose body was covered in sticky blood, said in the channel, "Everyone, get ready. Say goodbye to this damned war." Even if the gray tide outside had broken through the city's defense line several times, and the Ultralisks were all injured. The situation was unprecedentedly dangerous, but Fox's tone was still calm. The news was quite exciting. When the endless gray tide finally caught a glimpse of the edge, the exhaustion of fighting until the end of the world disappeared. Even if the situation was bad, at least the enemy could be killed, as long as they worked harder. In fact, they did not need to continue to work hard. When the central control room determined that most of the gray tide had entered the effective killing range, and this war had attracted all the enemies, the war could be declared over. Now, it was just a countdown. Purely in terms of destructive power, the evolved species that had entered the late stage were not inferior to any Ultralisks. Under the irrigation of thousands of years of knowledge in the present realm, they had far surpassed them. As early as 100 years ago, the nuclear weapons stockpiled by mankind were enough to overturn the entire present realm. 100 years had passed, and although the times had changed, as if the world had changed, the sad thing was that mankind still hadn't changed. As several flight formations rose from the runway, broke through the obstruction of the erosion-breeding birds, and flew into the distance, everyone could not help but breathe a sigh of relief. What happened next was nothing worth mentioning. It was nothing more than continuing to defend and waiting. They were waiting for the 17 heavy mass generators that could cover millions of miles of the gray tide to be in place. With the countdown in the central control room, 3 hours passed in a flash. Fox threw himself into a chair and took a deep puff of his homemade tobacco pipe. He couldn't hide his exhaustion. Do you know what I'm most grateful for right now? He looked around and looked at his colleagues in the last half a minute of the countdown. Fortunately, this F*King world is leaking. A burst of laughter rang out. Everyone stared intently at the countdown, as if they were celebrating the new year, full of anticipation as they chanted in unison. 10, 9, 8. In the roar, the metal city shook again. The buffer layer was instantly blasted and demolished, replaced by thousands of bolt-like steel columns that violently connected the entire city and the steel composite structure in the underground fortifications that had been completed long ago. It was as if a nail had been hammered into the stable stratum. 7, 6, 5. Everyone! In the sky, the undying bird suddenly flapped its wings and once again unleashed a terrifying flame that swept across hundreds of miles, instantly clearing all the gray tide around the city. Then it swooped down and roared in the public channel. Prepare for impact. Needless to say, long before the countdown began, all the giant beasts ran up to Weischer's back one by one, allowing the layers of sorrowful rope to tie themselves up like dumplings. Tears streamed down their faces, but they did not come down. They did not even struggle. Instead, they kept on ordering, "Tie it up 2 more times, bro, a little more. You're already crying like this, and you still want more? So, what if I'm emotional?" Okay. Weischer readily followed its advice. Fearing that it would not be satisfied, he even rubbed a ball and stuffed it into its mouth. Looking at its excited face, it should be very happy. Then, Weischer lay down in the hole that it had just made. It even tried to burrow down a little, its 2 front claws digging into the ground like an excavator. In an instant, it had dug out a hole big enough to bury half of itself. After burrowing into it, it lay down and would not move even if it was beaten to death. As for the gray tide that was excitedly pouncing on the metal city, it could not be bothered, and the countdown had finally reached its end. 3, 2, 1. As the earth suddenly shook, the world fell silent. It was as if someone had opened a bottle of champagne in a faraway place and simply pulled out the cork, making a popping sound. Then a shuddering sense of danger rose in the consciousness of every giant beast. They burrowed into the soil, but they heard the wailing of the earth. The earth's crust was shaking, roaring, and falling apart. Terrifying heat spewed out from the Earth's mantle with unprecedented geological movements. In an instant, the whole world was illuminated by the remaining lava, and it was blood red. The blood-red flames were flowing into the distance. It was as if it was being pulled by invisible little hands. At first, it was a breeze that was difficult to detect. Then, it became a howling wind that rushed into the distance. The last remaining thin air was ruthlessly swept away, along with the countless screaming gray tide on the earth. The world was violently shaking. Everything between heaven and earth was thrown into a small box, and then put into the drum of a washing machine, spinning and shaking wildly. Everything was in turmoil. Even though there were layers of mountains between them, the giant beast next to Huaisher screamed in horror. "Stand still! Don't go over there! You're squeezing me to death! It's not me!" Huaisher buried his head in the soil in horror. "Something is sucking me over there." Everything in the world was drifting in all directions. The earth suddenly tightened in an instant, like a blanket that had been pulled, and then it fell apart amidst the wailing of countless earth and rocks. If one looked down from the sky, one would be able to see the tragic scene of the boundless earth cracking inch by inch and being covered by lava. If this place was set as a planet, then the planet would have exploded at this moment, under the encirclement of the 17 small black dots. With the activation of the heavy mass generator, the 17 gravitational poles were instantly formed under the irrigation of a huge amount of energy. Even in physics, a law that was a taboo was activated here. Rather than calling it a law, it was better to call it a vicious bug. In Zarathustra's great mystery, countless laws were difficult to cover and resolve. They could only be forcibly blocked and refused to activate branch possibilities. Just like how skyscrapers would have some small flaws, in some cases, when the complex laws in physics collided, it would produce some situations that even the creator had not imagined. And in these many situations, if the preconditions were met, then it would lead to the birth of an infinitely small singularity with infinite mass and infinite gravitational force that could even distort space and time. In other words, it was a black hole. Now, 17 celestial bodies that only existed in popular literature were instantly born on this land, showing their tyrannical majesty. In just a few seconds, 1/10 of the world was violently hollowed out. From the center, if one looked down, one could see through the thick bottom layer to the abyss of the void at the bottom. At this moment, this world with a square sky and a square earth was being ravaged, together with all the erosive seeds. The moment the heavy mass generator was activated, more than 2/3 of the erosive seeds were sucked into it, crushed into pieces, and disappeared. The remaining erosive seeds were screaming and fleeing. Finally, under the terrifying gravitational pull, they were pulled into the eternal darkness. 3 seconds. When the 3 seconds that were comparable to the destruction of the world itself had passed, the entire world had become a ruin. The apocalyptic world had completely ushered in the true end of the world under its ravaging. Fortunately, the dead world would not be able to kill it again. Smashing a broken jar was just recycling waste. Even so, the entire metal city, together with the heavy underground fortifications below, was pulled out of the ground by dozens of meters. If it were not for the fact that its mass was too huge, it would have been pulled into the sky by now. If it was unlucky enough to fall into the gravitational field, it would be instantly torn to pieces. There was no way to guard against it. There was no way to defend. This was the most terrifying place in Zarathustra. Even if there were countless terrifying existences in the endless depths of hell, as long as the 3 great mystic instruments were still around, those unimaginable horrors would never be willing to enter the present realm. The value of the Creator was in construction and protection, but more often than not, once the power they brought was used for killing, no ascendant could compare to it. Even the general, who was once the most promising person to approach heaven and earth, punched with all his strength, was comparable to a nuclear explosion. But was nuclear explosions really that rare in the modern realm? It was possible to find a garage, steal some uranium ore, and finally get an ordinary professor who was not afraid of death to achieve it. Although the effect was incomparable, it was not easy. But how could this kind of thing, that could be mass-produced and increased in production, not be better than a lunatic who did not listen to orders? No matter how powerful the angel fighter was, the resources spent in order to cultivate an angel fighter were enough to buy a fighter fleet. After all, behind every high-level ascendant was one or even several full vaults that had been burned. It was really not cost-effective. It was a pity that this was probably the last time the Eternal Titan Empire would see such a scene. After all, this was not the present realm. After leaving the city, all laws would be invalid, and the alchemy that could maintain the heavy mass generator was only done by Hydra. It was not a city that needed to be rebuilt, nor was it hundreds of thousands of victims and other dead beasts, nor was it a worse environment. This was the most disastrous loss they had suffered this time. Chapter 373. Fortunately, today's Eternal Titan Empire was the only living thing left in this world. Even the enemy no longer existed. This might be the mercy of the Creator. The leaders of the large group formed by the mutants were the easiest to deal with. They were nothing more than a slightly stronger wild beast. The Creator did not arrange any destructive subordinates or personal troops to come over, which was already equivalent to an easy level of difficulty. If they encountered a Creator with a worse personality, it was not impossible for a bug like the surviving evil to appear. Now, the surviving mutants had fled in all directions. It would not be long before they welcomed death in the desolation and vacuum. Right? The great enemy was gone. When Weisher inadvertently looked back, he saw that the faint fog shrouding the city was also disappearing rapidly. In a trance, he seemed to see a vague outline, but he could not see it clearly. In an instant, it disappeared with the fog. Only a pair of eyes looked at him and waved at him faintly. The fog dissipated together with the illusion. Weisher was stunned for a long time. He did not know why he felt that the gaze was particularly familiar. Don't be stunned. The undying bird passed by him. Everyone, let's have a meeting. How's the rescue situation? We're rushing to do emergency repairs and first aid. What about the damage assessment? It's still in the drafting stage, but a conservative estimate is that at least 1/3 of the factories and equipment need large-scale maintenance and reprocessing. Sounds good. At least it's still within the acceptable range. The undying bird nodded. So what's the next situation? It's terrible. Fox sighed. To be exact, it's terrible. Hydra shouldn't be so impulsive. If he were to be snobbish, he would rather use 3 times the loss to exchange for Hydra's loss. But at that time, it would be completely overturned. If Hydra stood by and did nothing, it was still unknown whether everyone would still be able to sit here and chat. Even if the consequences were tragic, it was still a pain that had to be endured. If they wanted to survive, sometimes they had to make some sacrifices. Even if it was to drink poison to quench their thirst, as long as they could linger on at death's door for a second, they would not care about anything else. Isn't there still the alchemists? Although it's sad to say this, but the two sides are on completely different levels. After pondering for a moment, Fox said straightforwardly, "The difference in size between the two sides is like the difference between the strongest kobold in the city and the Weisher. With their abilities, just taking over all the alchemy matrices left behind by Hydra is already difficult enough. Asking them to take a step further in the development and production of the alchemy matrices is just a dream." The Phoenix was silent for a long time. It looked disappointed, but it could not help but sigh in relief. Fortunately, at the very least, the depth control instrument and sediment discharge matrix in the city could still continue to operate. Otherwise, without the Hydra, the entire city would have turned into the abyss sooner or later. At that time, the Eternal Titan Empire would probably have the word hell added to it. Is there any worse news? Bad news. Fox slammed a thick stack of reports on the table. I have a bunch here. Which one do you want to hear? The Phoenix shrugged. Let's talk about the worst one first. We're all still alive. What's the second worst? We will all die. Fox looked around at everyone and calmly said, It's just that some people will die in front of everyone. No one said anything. In the silence, they all felt an indescribable heaviness at the same time. The joy of victory had disappeared without a trace. This was not a decisive battle, but an arduous journey with no end in sight. There was no such thing as automatically entering a happy ending after defeating the boss. They could only move forward together. They tied each other with safety ropes and climbed an endless snowy mountain, relying on their own thin body temperature to fight against the harsh world. But no matter how much they supported each other, someone would fall first. Every time one of them fell, their efficiency of moving forward would slow down a little, until the first snowflake that fell caused an irreversible collapse. The situation completely collapsed. Death was like an avalanche, covering everyone. Before the arrival of death, they did not have the luxury of breathing. Cheer up. The Phoenix's low voice dispelled the depressed and uneasy atmosphere. Its majestic eyes scanned the surroundings. If you want to admit defeat, leave immediately and go home to lie on the sofa. If you're a man, no. If you really have a little sense of responsibility for this world, then put away that childish face of yours when you hear that winter and summer vacations are canceled. Everyone looked shocked and subconsciously held their heads high. The Phoenix looked around at them and nodded with satisfaction. That's more like it. I'm not asking you to work hard to pay the mortgage during the day. Sign the divorce agreement with your wife at night. Go home and help your children with their homework. At best, you'll just die. What's there to be afraid of? There was a burst of laughter among the giant beasts. It seemed that only this kind of cold and heartless adult joke could warm people's hearts at this time. If you looked at it this way, the apocalypse was gentler than the present. At least they didn't have to worry about the monthly loan when they opened their eyes every day. Are you all awake? The Phoenix withdrew its gaze. If you're all awake, get to work. There's no time for you to dawdle. Do you hear me? Go to work. Under its impatient command, the giant beasts dispersed in a hubbub. In the silence, Fox stood in place and looked at it with its head tilted. Why don't you let me continue? If I continue, everyone doesn't have to work. Just leave and go home. Without long-term considerations, there must be immediate worries. Fox sighed. I just want everyone to understand the seriousness of the situation. Thinking about success or failure and how to succeed or fail is between the two of us. The Phoenix replied calmly, leading people to march is not leading people to do research. It's a bit cruel to say this, but the soldiers who rush to the battlefield don't need to worry about things like supplies and whether there will be friendly artillery support after a month. They just need to rush forward and be done with it. Fox was silent for a long time and sighed softly. It's not necessarily a bad thing to die with hope. I don't know whether it's good or bad, but no one here is afraid of death. The Phoenix told him, They're not afraid, I'm not afraid, so you shouldn't be afraid. Fox smiled bitterly. But if possible, who doesn't want to live well? Yes, the Phoenix whispered. Because of this, sacrifice will be meaningful, won't it? It stopped talking and rose into the air and flew into the distance. After the end of that battle, the intensive production still continued. Although there was no air in the outside world, the Titan Empire still found a way to synthesize oxygen after putting up the isolation shield. After the discussion and hosting of many scholars, the race began to evolve again. After neglecting the improvement of physical fitness, the focus was on the enhancement of resistance and tolerance. After reducing the consumption of intake, the resistance to a large number of negative states was enhanced. Once they stepped into the standard, the technological ability of the entire Titan Empire began to improve rapidly. Without the obstacles of the laws and regulations of the present world, no matter how inhumane the experiments and modifications were, they went smoothly, as if success was achieved when the conditions were right, and the results were remarkable. Whether it was the extraction of the genes from the giant beasts for modification or the acceleration of their own mechanization after 3 transformations and collectivization surgery, it was difficult to distinguish the original race of the residents just by looking at their appearance. Not only the appearance, but the organs and survival methods in the body were gradually converging. It was as if the integration process was unbelievably smooth. And just as the last evolution was completed, everyone observed a thin fog shrouding the sky above the city. Compared to the last time Huaisher saw it, it was undoubtedly much thicker, as if it was gradually growing stronger. There were faint fluctuations of origin substance, but it was difficult to see the traces of origin substance flowing and interfering with matter. The moment the fog formed, the scholars fell into a state of shock. Huaisher also felt a rhythm coming from within his body. It was the sleeping souls of hundreds of thousands of lizard men responding to the call of the fog. Huaisher hesitated for a moment, but no longer restrained them. Soon, wisps of white gas rose from under his scales and merged with the fog along with the gentle hymns, causing the fog to become even thicker. It was not clear whether to say that he was relieved of a burden or disappointed. The departure of hundreds of thousands of lizardmen's souls made Huaisher's consciousness much more relaxed and nimble, and he no longer had the clumsy feeling of carrying a heavy load. However, after getting used to carrying a heavy load in the past, Huaisher actually felt a little uncomfortable. It was a little too light. The lizardmen did not take away Huaisher's beloved RGB halo. Instead, they generously gifted him with all of their remaining origin substance and faith. They didn't even take away their own memories. They simply merged their most fundamental consciousness into the fog. Immediately after, the fog seemed to have eaten a great tonic as it rapidly condensed. In the end, it actually formed an illusionary spring water that flashed and disappeared. That feeling was exceptionally familiar, and Huaisher was stunned for a long time. He couldn't believe it. The Silver Sea. That was indeed the impression that the Silver Sea had left on Huaisher. It was the place where all of the present realm's knowledge and mysteries flowed out, the sea of miracles that contained all of the miracles and souls. However, compared to the spectacular scene that Huaisher had once witnessed, this spring was somewhat shabby and insignificant. However, the essence of the two was undoubtedly the same. It wasn't just Huaisher who could tell. Everyone could tell. Very quickly, the eyes of dozens of ordinary members in the city lit up with the light of origin substance, and they instantly underwent a transformation. A sublimator had appeared. The scholars all sucked in a breath of cold air. Although there were many differences between sublimators and sublimators, and even their souls were the same as blank slates, there was no doubt that this was a soul structure unique to sublimators. They had been bestowed with souls. The huge surprise made everyone feel excited. Although this power was still too small compared to the current giant beasts, no matter what, it was still a rare and valuable improvement. It was just like how Gagarin, the astronaut of the Russian Federation, had taken his first step on the moon. It was of great significance. Putting aside the existence of the sublimators, the moment the Silver Sea appeared, the various laws that had been set up inside the city quickly stabilized. It was as if they had been wedged into this space, and they no longer needed to be maintained as tediously as before. It was as if a large factory had replaced the original small workshop of the scholars. It could almost be regarded as a small Zarathustra's secret apparatus. This was crucial to the stability of the eternal Titan Empire. With such an unexpected good thing happening, everyone's confidence in getting through the end of the world was boosted. This might be the last ray of light before the long winter night arrived. From that day onwards, the temperature began to drop day by day. Chapter 374. More than a month later, when Huaishir opened his eyes, he felt a burst of discomfort in his nostrils. He took 2 deep breaths before he felt the remains in his nasal cavity fly out and hit the ground like cannonballs. The ice cubes mixed with a large amount of iron chips shattered on the ground. Immediately after, a burning pain emerged from his nostrils. His nasal mucosa, which was relatively fragile compared to his armor, was frostbitten. He spat out 2 mouthfuls of fire with great effort, and his stiff body finally warmed up a little. When he moved, the frozen scales made a sharp sound, and a large amount of thin frost fell to the ground, making the crisp sound of metal colliding. Huaishir twisted his neck and felt the bones in his body creaking. He could not help but sigh. When will these days come to an end? 190. 75 degrees Celsius at Huaishir's feet. The frozen giant thermometer still maintained the last display before his death. Huaishir shook his head. It was 10 degrees lower. As he moved his body and ate a large amount of iron ore again, the temperature in his body gradually rose, melting the thin layer of frost under his feet. The body temperature, which was like an oven, turned a large amount of frozen water into hot air and spread out, causing the kobolds in heavy protective clothing around him to moan in comfort. Huaishir yawned, still feeling a little sleepy. As the temperature gradually dropped, even someone as energetic as him gradually felt sleepy a few days ago. When he could not take it anymore, he took a nap. How long did I sleep? 6 hours. The person in charge of the smelting center said, "It's time to start work." According to the production plan, we still have a gap of about 14,000 tons. Thank you for your hard work. It's no big deal. Huaishir smacked his lips and looked up. Prop up the biggest furnace. We might as well finish it in one go. Will it work? At most, I'll sleep for a while after I'm done. Huaishir waved his hand nonchalantly. There was no wind in the vacuum. Nowadays, everyone could only communicate through radio when they were outdoors. Giant beasts could communicate with origin substances, but they had to be careful when talking to normal people, especially someone like Huaishir. His origin substance had already crystallized into tens of thousands of tons in his bone marrow. If he raised his voice just a little, it would be easy for him to turn a normal person into a vegetable. Deified creatures were scary to ordinary people. Even a sublimata would get a headache if they talked to Huaishir for too long. It didn't matter how hard Huaishir tried to suppress his will. Under Huaishir's orders, the engineering team started to restart the production line and the factory to complete the warm-up. Ever since the weather became colder and colder, the huge metal smelting furnace that had just been built a few days ago was abandoned because it wasted too much heat and was not cost-effective enough. Only an existence like Huaishir would be able to save a little more effort and time and get it done in one go. Before the ceiling opened, Huaishir warmed up his body. He took a deep breath and spat out a few wisps of flame. When he felt the temperature rise, he took a deep breath. Scary flames spewed out. In an instant, the furnace in front of him was burning red. Only the beginning stages of smelting ores could use such a crude method. As long as the temperature rose, it would be easy to do anything. But the weather was too bad. This time, Huaishir had to spit until his mouth was dry, before he was able to boil the molten steel. He was so young, but he didn't have enough firepower. Weisher fell into a deep depression. He started to think about whether he had been too reckless, and his body was starting to feel weak. That couldn't be right. Aside from some slight signs of rheumatism, there was nothing wrong with him. This damned weather was too annoying. Since 2 months ago, the temperature had been dropping day by day. Now, it was almost 200 degrees below zero, and it didn't seem to be stopping. According to the scholars' estimates, the temperature would not stop until it dropped to 270 degrees below zero. By then, it would be close to absolute zero. With the current technology, it could only reach this level. No, it should be said that thermodynamics had drawn this boundary from the beginning to maintain the greatest degree of stability. Even the heat death of the apocalypse would not be exaggerated to go below 270 degrees. The area below that was meaningless even to hell. At the very least, in the current abyss exploration, except for the talents of some creatures and the authority of the Lord of a large group, there was no environment in hell that could reach below absolute zero. For Weisher, there was no need for the temperature to reach 270 degrees. He had already begun to miss his woolen trousers. By the way, what do you think about my woolen trousers? The person in charge of the smelting center was silent for a long time. His tone was complicated. Fox thought you were joking. I didn't mention it again. But his expression at that time was very interesting. It was the kind of expression that said, "You must be joking, right? Please tell me you must be joking." His expression, to be honest, I don't think it's very realistic. Why is it not realistic? Weisher's eyes widened. I have contributed so much to the Empire. Why won't the Empire give me a pair of woolen trousers? You have to be able to afford it. Brother! The person in charge glanced at him helplessly. Forget about the woolen trousers. Knitting a pair of underwear for you will use up all our current thermal insulation materials. Weisher was silent for a long time. Suddenly, he said seriously, "You reminded me, I don't wear underwear. So, can you find a way to make one for me? If it's not possible to make a pair of boxers, bullet pants will do. Can't we at least negotiate now?" After the person in charge cleaned up the blood, he spat through the mask. He took 2 deep breaths and waved his hand righteously. "I don't think it's possible." "You don't have to think it. No one can think it's possible. Tisk, capitalists really don't shed any blood or tears." Weisher glanced at him in disdain. He raised his hand and scratched his teeth. Then he used his ability to pull out 2 iron pillars that were hundreds of meters long. When he held them in his 2 hands, they felt like 2 slender iron skewers. "Wait a minute, what are you doing?" "Knitting trousers." Weisher put his 2 hands together and kept twisting a thick steel cable. He rolled it together like a ball of yarn and tied it into a huge ball. The 2 iron skewers collided and burst out a burst of dazzling sparks in the vacuum. Weisher moved his fingers a little to find the feeling. He raised his head and asked, "Do you want to learn? I will teach you. You don't look like you have a girlfriend. You can knit a sweater for yourself later." "No, thank you." For some reason, the person in charge seemed to be very angry. Was it because he couldn't learn how to knit? That was strange. Weisher shook his head and clicked his tongue twice. He didn't pay any more attention to him. He didn't think about whether the steel cable wool trousers could keep him warm or how embarrassing it was to wear a pair of dog sleigh wool trousers. The days of trying to find joy in the midst of bitterness came to an end when the temperature officially fell below 200 degrees. Huang Qianqian can't hold on any longer. At the emergency meeting, Fox brought another piece of bad news. As their only source of drinking water, Huang Qianqian had been under considerable pressure. After all, It was okay to have no electricity and no food, but having no water was no joke. Moreover, compared to personal use, the shortage of industrial water was the biggest problem. Huaishi's large-scale smelting center was even more water-consuming. A large amount of toxic wastewater was produced during the refining and synthesis of some rare alloys. It couldn't even be used twice. Now that Huang Qianqian was gone, it was undoubtedly bad news. Wasn't it fine 2 days ago? At this temperature, I can't wait to peel off my skin and make a cotton-padded jacket when I go out, let alone a jellyfish. Fox said expressionlessly, "It's not easy to hold on until now. If you have time later, say goodbye to her." By the time Huaishi saw Huang Qianqian again, he almost couldn't recognize her. In his original impression, the beautiful jellyfish that was large enough to cover the entire city was now broken into pieces, twitching in the warm pool with difficulty. He could vaguely see the small organs in it slowly pulsating, full of pain. Even if she didn't really die during the witch's night, the pain she felt before dying definitely wouldn't be any less. In fact, it might even be stronger. After all, the behemoth's large size meant that it had more nerves and more subbrains. One portion of pain could even become 2 portions. After using the medicine, her condition finally improved a bit. An origin substance figure slowly rose from her body, as if it was using her original appearance. It was a middle-aged woman, wearing glasses, wearing a suit, and looking capable. After seeing Fox and Phoenix, she slowly nodded. "I didn't disappoint you, my friends." Before this, she had already exhausted the last of her ability to create a massive iceberg in the extreme cold. It was almost as large as Huaishi. With the current purification cycle, it was enough to support the next generation of industrial purifiers. Otherwise, her condition wouldn't be so bad. However, the Phoenix and the Fox also agreed to this action. Even though it would be painful for her before she was on the verge of death, it was better to take advantage of the fact that she still had energy to recover as much as possible. "Thank you for your dedication." Fox asked, "Is there anything else we can do?" "No need. The research that needs to be done has already been completed. I should have left a long time ago." Huang Qianqian shook her head, and the origin substance slowly dissipated. "I wish you good luck." In the warm pool, the jellyfish's body suddenly collapsed inch by inch, melting and dissipating. In the end, what appeared from her body was a dark green spring. An endless stream of water flowed out from it. This was the final gift she had left behind. Even though it wasn't enough to supply industry, it was more than enough clean water for all the evolved races to drink. After a short period of silence, Fox stared at the pool and couldn't help but sigh. "Next, we need to carry out the migration plan." He turned around and said seriously, "According to the map drawn by the previous satellite, we need to find another area with abundant geothermal energy. According to the plan, everyone should start preparing." The sorrowful atmosphere was instantly dispelled, and everyone once again threw themselves into their busy work. About a month later, the metal city enveloped in a thick layer of insulation was pulled by thousands of tower cranes and slowly landed on Huaishi's back. It fit perfectly with the base. As Huaishi slowly stood up, the metal city on his back didn't move in the slightest. It didn't even shake in the slightest. "This time, I'm really going to become a sled dog." Huaishi turned around. His 4 hands tightened the steel cable straps on his body. After moving his body a bit, he pulled on the sorrowful rope. With the support of the tracks, the enormous iceberg suddenly shook and slid out with him into the depths of the icy darkness. Without saying a word, they embarked on the path of migration. In the original city, only layers of frost appeared from the entrance of the underground fortifications. There was no sound in the silence, Only the originally lonely satellite still flickered with a dim light, illuminating Huaishi's back. They gradually went further and further away. It seems like a lot of friends can't see this in the author chat. Actually, I'm very diligent in asking for votes every month. It's the last day, so please vote for me. Chapter 375. He walked about 410,000 miles to the south. He passed through the barren plains, walked past the collapsed mountains, and finally stepped onto the dry seabed. The world was dark. There was no other sound except for Huaishi's footsteps and the rumbling of the moving iceberg behind him. In the silence, Huaishi paused and looked around blankly. "What's wrong?" Fox in the observation room asked. "I think I heard a voice." Huaishi scratched the back of his head. Sparks flew. "It seems like someone is calling me." Fox was silent for a long time. "I think it's because there's no one to talk to. Your ears are getting restless." "I really heard it." Okay. I'll call the talk team to come to work. Okay? "I really didn't mean that. I'll call 2 more for you, okay?" "Okay." Huaishi nodded. "So fragrant." Then he threw the whispers echoing in his ears to the back of his mind. The tip of his nose hurt a little. It seemed like he had been kicked by something small. Huaishi rubbed his nose, grinned, and continued to gallop with the iceberg in the cold vacuum, disappearing into the distance. He gave up trying to communicate. "This guy is a dog, right? He must be a dog. Everyone has turned into a dog. I didn't expect that he was the only one who showed his true form." His spirit was so tenacious that he could continue to laugh foolishly even at the end of the world. He didn't know what to say. She could only admire him deeply. She felt that she must have turned into mist. At least, that was the case at the beginning. She swore that she had originally intended to listen to Huaishi's words and was prepared to leave. But before leaving, she suddenly thought of something. There seems to be a piece of divine remains in my space that the old granny gave me. Since I'm leaving, why don't I just use it?" She completely ignored the originally handsome old granny's careful reminder, and the warning that the success rate was only 30%. He took out the divine remains. He clicked on it, and he succeeded. It was faster than expected. Rather than calling it a skeleton, it would be more accurate to call it a wisp of mist sealed in amber. It opened with a slight twist. Then it naturally merged with Fu Yi's body, turning her already transparent little body completely invisible. In the end, Fu Yi completely disappeared from the Astronomical Society's observation. To a certain extent, he had indeed left the stage. However, she didn't seem to have retreated to the outside world. Instead, after losing her body, her origin substance seemed to have undergone a miraculous transformation. Even her spirit form characteristics seemed to have disappeared. She exited the game, but the client did not close. Instead, she entered the perspective of a bystander. She no longer needed food, water, or even air. Everyone's consciousness was like a shining bubble. She could easily pass through it and observe the sparks that were constantly bursting out of their souls as they thought. It was even possible to slightly adjust the direction of the sparks. No one would notice that there was a small hand quietly interfering with their thoughts, inadvertently neglecting some important things. Then Huaishi would tire her to death. This bastard swallowed hundreds of thousands of lizardmen's origin substances in one go, evolving from steel Garuru into Huaishi's cinerary urn. It was like peeling hundreds of thousands of crayfish in one go, stripping all the lizardman's pain and despair from the core of Huaishi's consciousness at once, so that he wouldn't really become a mad dog. Fu Yi had never peeled so many crayfish in her life, and she didn't want to see this kind of damn thing in the future. So, this bastard didn't feel wronged at all for taking on two people's divine punishment at once. There was always a price to pay for being stubborn. Then, Fu Yi, who had overexerted herself, fell asleep, sinking into the hundreds of thousands of lizardmen's dreams, like a fish returning to the ocean. She felt a burst of carefree feeling. It was as if this was her domain, and reality was just another bigger dream outside the dream. What kind of creature was this? Or were some creatures just like this? Sometimes she would think like this, but most of the time she would just wander through one dream after another, bored. Then she would watch Weisher's stupid appearance through the halo of light. What happened next was nothing to write home about. She jumped from one dream to another until she finally arrived at a city that seemed to have been tailor-made for her. She once again fell into a busy state. Instinctively, she used the origin substances to connect one consciousness after another, forming a massive network. Finally, she guided the origin substances to flow through this invisible network. She watched as one strange silhouette after another emerged from this complex network, searching for some kind of principle to operate within it. Prototype. Inexplicably, this realization appeared in her consciousness. Unlike Weisher, who was an ignorant and incompetent person, Fu Yi was still a good student. She had even read a little about the prototype theory, which was an obscure philosophy that most students didn't understand at all. At the very least, she had some understanding of it, whether it was called a meme or a prototype, regardless of whether it had self-awareness or not. This was the conclusion that intelligent creatures would subconsciously come to when stimulated by external stimuli. It was just like how primitive murals used red to represent the sun, and death was always pitch black and terrifying. This was a feeling that didn't need to be conveyed through words. It was a kind of human intelligence that reacted to certain aspects of the world. This kind of ability existed in every creature's consciousness. In the end, it flowed through the network and into the fog that Fu Yi was in. It formed a sea of consciousness that only existed in theories and legends. Fu Yi felt like she had turned from a stoat into a sea otter. Not only did her appearance not change, but she also had to work hard to expand the environment that she lived in. She had to work hard to stabilize the sea of fog so that she could feel more comfortable. Thankfully, time was always speeding up. As long as she had this thought, it would naturally take action. This saved her from exhausting her willpower through repetitive work. Not only that, but she also had to work hard to avoid losing too much. After the astral beasts left, she had to intercept a portion of the origin substances that had dissipated and merge it with the sea that she had entered. If the distance was too great, she would be unable to do anything. This extra portion of energy could be used to create a few more ascenders. She had completely turned into an old farmer. She hoped that a few acres of crops would quickly grow. Fu Yi's heart was filled with despair. If she had known earlier, she would have left as soon as possible. This endless overtime was really too much. Could it be that she had accidentally offended that handsome old granny? That couldn't be, right? They chatted quite happily. The days passed in this way, day after day of hard work. Under Fu Yi's efforts, the entire place finally looked a little more like it should, until one day, in the increasingly cold weather of the outside world, she heard the words of the fox. "We need to leave this place." The fox said, "We need to find the earth tropics." Fu Yi silently watched as the entire city began to move again. She forcefully roused herself and carried the Silver Sea on an unknown journey. Apart from the fox herself, she was the only one who knew. This was a lie. There was no earth tropics at all. Regardless of whether or not this was a planet, or whether or not there was a core or mantle, even lava should have cooled down a long time ago in this kind of bitterly cold weather. This world had already died. Could she still hope that the lava that was her bloodline would continue to remain warm? There was only a long road ahead of them. There was no end. She sighed softly, but did not expose its lie. At least, the silver sea, which was cold because of the reflection of reality in the past, now had a glimmer of hope. As long as there was hope, it was always a good thing. But it was still so annoying. Fui sighed and kicked Huaishur hard. As usual, this guy had no reaction at all. Looking at his heartless appearance, Fui was angry. If she had known earlier, she would not have modified his memory. At least let him worry about her, so that he would not be idle all day and die of boredom. She returned to the thin silver sea and fell into a deep sleep again. In the current dome of the metal city, the fox saw the immortal bird. The latter was looking at the endless darkness outside the porthole. When she heard the fox come in, she turned back and asked, "When are you going to tell them the truth?" "What truth?" The fox looked calm, as if he did not understand. "You know what I'm talking about," the immortal bird said. "Are you going to hide it from them like this?" The fox glanced at it and asked, "Didn't I learn this from you? I always feel that you make sense in everything you do. But these are two completely different things, aren't they?" The immortal bird said seriously, "If lies are said to be good intentions, deceiving people to die, and deceiving them to continue living are completely different. The former can be released in the end, but the latter will be tortured. Sometimes death is much easier than living. You are now deceiving them to pursue an endless hope, but there will be a day when dreams and hopes will be shattered. When they discover that there is no tropical zone in this world, what are you going to use to continue leading them forward?" The fox sighed and took off his hat, revealing the sparse hair on his head. "Is there a better way?" "I do," the immortal bird said firmly, "but you have to listen to my arrangements." "Okay." The fox nodded. 30 minutes later, Bichimo's advance came to an abrupt halt. Huaishur turned back in astonishment. "What the hell? A meeting?" The immortal bird said. "First of all, a piece of bad news." At the impromptu emergency meeting, the immortal bird said, "It's now minus 240 degrees Celsius. I'm afraid we won't be able to catch up with the natural retreat of the tropical zone. There's a 70% chance that we will miss." "What?" Huaishur was stunned. "Then I've walked for nothing? Failed explorations are for more possibilities of success." After a moment of silence, the immortal bird suddenly said, "I have a suggestion that can be implemented. No, it should be in order." As the direct leader of all the explorers now, and the member in the front row of all the members of the Astronomical Society present, I ask you to completely obey my orders. It told everyone straightforwardly, "Next, I will ignite myself." Amidst everyone's shock and astonishment, the immortal bird told everyone present, "I will become the new sun." This was its solution. On the first day of the month, please vote. Chapter 376. That's ridiculous. This was Huaishur's first reaction. "Brother, what are you thinking?" But then he felt that it was not completely unreasonable, but wasn't this a bit too tragic? Huaishur asked bluntly, "What's the difference between this and burning people as firewood?" "The difference is that at least we have firewood to burn," the undying bird replied calmly. "Otherwise, we will freeze to death." "I object," Huaishur said directly. "It's not that time yet. Is your objection useful, Huaishur?" The undying bird glanced at him indifferently. "Now that you have been urgently recruited, I am your direct superior. Execute my orders. Don't talk nonsense." Now he finally looked like a soldier. When he spoke, he was calm and cold, and no one could refute him. His eyes were rude and rude. Huaishur did not speak again. "Is it feasible?" Taurus asked again. "We don't have the technical reserves in this area at present. Although it is a little difficult, it is not difficult. The pale fox sent the report to everyone, and everyone had a copy. Next, the undying bird will become a fire seed and start to burn. With a conservative estimate, if the minimum amount of heat is released steadily with our current thermodynamic equipment, we can probably guarantee a stable burning for 4,000 years. Someone asked, what about after 4,000 years? After 4,000 years, there will be a change. The undying bird said, according to their own species and attributes, I will be the first, blue bird will be the second, and the third. The specific list is here. If you have any opinions, you can raise them here. No one spoke. Big Brother took the lead to sacrifice, and the people behind him still dared to talk nonsense. It was embarrassing. There were many explorers who were afraid of death, not to mention that they would not really die. Then it's settled. The undying bird made the decision. Next, Weischer will assist the engineering team in the mining of minerals and be responsible for the construction of the huge framework of the metallurgical center. Fox will lead the team to solve the technical problems, and we will start in a month. After I leave, Fox will continue to be in charge of the city management. His original authority will not change, and my authority will be handed over to Weischer. You have any objections? If not, then the meeting is adjourned. Wait a minute. Weischer put its head close to the window of the conference room in shock. Why did you give it to me? Also, why am I last on the list? You're the last one because you're only 17 years old. If possible, I don't want you to die before them. If you don't want to accept it, I can tell you another reason. It's because you're the biggest, so you can burn the longest. The immortal bird answered unhurriedly, I gave you the position of leader because you can control the situation. To put it bluntly, no matter how bad the situation is, you can stuff the guys who don't want to enter the furnace. Are you satisfied? Weischer was speechless. It was decided, regardless of whether Weischer was willing or not. Although there were some problems in the process, the central furnace was finally completed 2 months later. After some calculations, the effect was a little worse than the original design, but it was still tolerable. Then, goodbye, everyone. Before entering the silent furnace, the immortal bird looked around at everyone for the last time. It's really pleasant to work with everyone. He paused for a moment and said sincerely, I hope you can continue to work hard and don't give up. He didn't wait for the others to answer. It slowly closed its 6 wings and plunged into the darkness of the furnace. As the heavy gates of the furnace slowly closed, his figure could no longer be seen. Only the warm wind slowly blew out of the furnace, and a dazzling sun hung above the sky inside the city again. It was as if the sun had returned to this abandoned land. There was no quick death, but a slow end in the long and painful burning of 4,000 years. If only sacrificing one person could make the whole world continue, it was really worth it. It's voluntary. You don't have to be sad. Fox said, Isn't this the responsibility of the Astronomy Association? Even if it's a drill, it's not an excuse to escape. Is there no other way? Weischer asked. Of course there is. Fox calmly told him. It's just that those methods are not as effective as this one, and they don't have such a cost-effective ratio. Weischer didn't speak again. He just remained silent, gnawing on the stone pillar beside his mouth, and the sound of crunching spread out. The light of the immortal bird shone on him, as if the coldness that had seeped into his bones had also been dispelled, warming Weischer up. He quietly finished his lunch, then got up, carefully lifted the city inside the frame, and put it on his back. He said, Let's keep going. Where to? Fox asked. Anyway, it's the same everywhere. Why not go out for a walk? Weischer asked. Maybe we can find a place where there's still heat. Fox shook his head. The probability is too small. We have nothing to do anyway, right? Huaisher smiled and tightened the belt that fixed the frame. He felt the bursts of warmth on his back. It doesn't matter if there's a tropical zone or not. At least we have to keep moving forward. Fox didn't object anymore. He just sighed. Then as you wish, Mr. Atlas. Atlas, the giant who propped up the world in the myths of the Roman region. It wasn't a bad name to call him that. Huaisher looked at the endless darkness in front of him and stepped forward again. Big brother, who looks like a dog, come on. In the silence, there was a distant call that sounded like an auditory hallucination again. Huaisher was stunned for a moment and couldn't help but laugh. Then come on, be a qualified sled dog. Carrying the only remaining world, Huaisher's journey began again. He walked deeper into the darkness. Time began to accelerate again. Huaisher continued to walk forward. 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 3,000 years, as if in a trance, passed by with a nap. Along the way, he witnessed many solemn wonders. There were terrifying fortresses that were immersed in the deepest part of the darkness, exuding deadly malice. There were also dry stars that hung high in the sky and fell into dead silence. There were even more ruins and colossal statues. Those dead civilizations, in their final moments, all chose to carve rocks and leave behind their own images, hoping that they could be passed down to future generations. There were also some that were destroyed in the chaos of internal strife and war. Behind Huaisher, the Titan Empire continued to develop. After stabilizing its population of several million, its size had increased to 3 times its original size, and then it continued to shrink until it was only half of its original size. The speed of evolution became slower and slower, and the span of each evolution became larger and larger. In the end, compared to their original size, they had shrunk to 1/3 of their original size. Their eyes shone with the light of Origin's substance, like flames. This is very normal. Fox, whose fur had already fallen off, lay on the bed and said, "The trend of evolution is not that the stronger the better, but that the more suitable the better. Under the current circumstances, the smaller the size, the less the consumption, the more the growth. You look like you're going to die. I'm just going to die of old age. After all, I haven't undergone the deification transformation, and all of my evolution points have been invested into simulation." Fox was still calm. "After I die, the management of the city will be handed over to the Taurus." The Taurus was the only one that wasn't on the list because it didn't have anything to burn. Right now, it was constantly burning itself, controlling the entire city's energy supply. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that it was the city's heart. You can decide the city's matters yourselves. Huaisher had walked enough. He stopped and lay down on the ground. "I'm tired. I'm going to sleep for a while. What about after you wake up?" "I'll keep walking," Huaisher said. "I have nothing to do anyway." Fox was amused by his stubborn appearance. "You still haven't given up hope." "I haven't thought about hope or anything. I just don't want to admit defeat." Huaisher said, "At least I'm still alive." If he was still alive, then he had to keep moving forward. This wasn't a determination worthy of others' admiration. For Huaisher, it was a simple instinct. "Then I wish you a pleasant journey." Fox said, "Good night." "Good night." Huaisher closed his eyes and fell into a deep sleep. In his dream, he dreamt of a lake. When he opened his eyes again, he was woken up by the Taurus. "Where's Fox?" "He died 200 years ago." Taurus said, "You've been sleeping for around 800 years. Time really isn't reliable. I feel like I've only slept for 2 or 3 minutes. It hasn't even been half an hour since we started moving." Huaisher smiled. "What's the matter?" "The flames are about to extinguish. This time, it's the bluebird's turn." Taurus said, I wanted to wake you up to take a look." Huaisher nodded. After so many years, many giant beasts had already given up. They had sunk into their own slumber, waiting for their time to come. The blue bird seemed to be a little uneasy. After forcing a smile to everyone, it walked into the furnace. As the layers of gates opened, the flames illuminated Huaisher's eyes. He once again saw the undying bird. It was no longer the same as before. In the flames, a slightly old middle-aged man sat upright. When he felt the furnace door open, he raised his eyes and looked over. He was stunned for a moment, then immediately revealed a smile and looked at the blue bird. "Is it your turn?" The blue bird nodded. "I'm a little scared. It's normal to be scared, but it's not as lonely as imagined. It's just a little painful." The undying bird stretched out its hand and warmly rubbed her head. "It's good to get used to it. Just treat it as a nightmare. One day, someone will come in and wake you up. When that time comes, you have to smile like me, understand?" His movements were gentle, but the blue bird couldn't help but shed tears and nodded vigorously. "Okay." So the undying bird smiled, as if it was free, turned into ashes, and dissipated. The blue bird, bathed in the flames, turned around and waved goodbye to her companions outside the furnace. The furnace door closed. In silence, Huaisher retracted his gaze, climbed up from the ground, and once again stepped on the road ahead. The earth rumbled, playing the last stubborn melody in this dead world. He wanted to continue forward. They were still alive. They still existed. After the end of the second watch, begging for votes, you're tuning into the Mystic Fist YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.